The night Celeste Whitmore walked into that restaurant, 12 strangers quietly placed bets on how fast she'd be humiliated. They had no idea they were watching the beginning of something that would bring a billion-dollar empire to its knees and rebuild it stronger than anyone thought possible. A single father who fixed engines for a living, a billionaire CEO who had never once felt truly seen, and a board of men who were about to learn the most expensive lesson of their lives. This is their story. If it stays with you, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. The rain came down in sheets, not the soft cinematic kind that looks good in movies, the real Chicago kind, the kind that comes sideways off the lake and finds every gap in your jacket and punishes you for thinking an umbrella would be enough. Brennan Vale pulled into the parking garage on West Monroe with 4 minutes to spare, killed the engine of his 12-year-old pickup, and sat there in the dark for a long moment listening to the rain hammer the concrete above him. He looked terrible, and he knew it. He'd changed his shirt twice. The first one had a grease stain near the collar that he'd thought was gone after washing. It wasn't. The second one was fine, but it wrinkled on the drive over because he'd left it balled up in the back seat instead of hanging it like a sane person. He'd ironed it with his hand pressed flat against it for a full minute, which had done almost nothing. He was wearing the gray sport coat his sister Dana had bought him 2 Christmases ago and had never once let him forget he never wore. Tonight he was wearing it. He told himself that was for him. It wasn't. His phone buzzed. "Dana, you're going to be late. Aren't you?" "Brennan, I'm in the garage." "Dana, that's not inside the restaurant." "Brennan, give me a minute." "Dana, Brennan, go in. She's already there. She texted me." He stared at that last message for a second. She's already there. He hadn't thought about that she might also be nervous, might also have gotten there early because she didn't know what else to do with herself, might also be sitting somewhere right now wondering what kind of evening was about to unfold. He pocketed the phone, got out, and walked to the elevator. The restaurant was called Alara. It had been open for 3 years, and it had 2 Michelin stars and a waiting list that ran to 6 weeks on a good month. Brennan had looked it up online when Dana texted him the name, and his first thought had been that Dana had lost her mind, and his second thought had been that he should have bought a better shirt. He'd eaten at places like this exactly twice in his life, once at a work dinner when the shop got a contract with a fleet management company, and once at a cousin's rehearsal dinner where he'd spent most of the night cutting up steak for Mia because she was 6 and couldn't manage the knife. Mia. He thought about her for a second before he pushed through the front door. She was with his mother for the night, which she'd been fine with. More than fine, actually. His mother had promised her a movie and homemade popcorn, and Mia had basically pushed him out the door. "Go, Daddy. I'm busy." 8 years old and already managing his calendar. The hostess station was just inside, warm amber light, the quiet clink of glasses from somewhere deeper in the room, a low hum of conversation that had the particular quality of people trying to sound casual while spending a lot of money on dinner. "Reservation for Vale," Brennan said. "Of course." The hostess, young, polished, very good at not reacting to wrinkled shirts, smiled and picked up a menu. "Right this way." He followed her through the main dining room. He noticed somewhere in the back of his mind that a few heads turned as he walked. He assumed it was the wrinkled shirt. Later, he'd understand it was something else entirely. She was sitting at a table near the window. She had dark hair, pulled back simply, not elaborately, not with the kind of architectural effort that suggested hours in front of a mirror, just pinned back in a way that looked like it had taken 3 minutes and actually suited her. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress, the kind of color that holds itself against candlelight, and she was looking down at her phone when he approached, which meant he had a second or two to collect himself before she looked up. She was heavier than the photo Dana had shown him, or maybe the photo had been older. It didn't register to him as a surprise exactly. It was just information. The way a person's nose is a different shape and profile than straight on. She looked up, and she had the most immediately alert eyes he'd ever seen, dark brown, sharp, the kind of eyes that were doing 4 things at once and filing away everything. Those eyes did something in the first half second. A quick scan, a calculation. He recognized it because he'd done the same thing 1,000 times, assessing a vehicle before touching a wrench. What's the actual condition here? Where's the damage? What am I actually working with? Then those eyes went a little careful, like she was bracing for something. Brennan pulled out the chair across from her, but before he sat down, he looked at her directly and said, "You must be Celeste. I'm glad you didn't leave." A beat. "I almost did," she said. He sat down. "What stopped you?" She looked at him for a moment, measuring, still careful. "The breadbasket. It arrived right before you did, and I wasn't going to let it go to waste." He laughed, not a polite laugh, a real one, sudden and short. "That's honest." "I try to be." She reached for her water glass. "Most people find it inconvenient. Most people are easily inconvenienced." The careful look in her eyes shifted, just slightly, a tiny recalibration. What Brennan didn't know, what he had no possible way of knowing, was what had happened in the 15 minutes before he walked through that door. Celeste had arrived at 7:50 for an 8 o'clock reservation, which was what she always did. Arriving early gave her control over seating, over sight lines, over the dynamic of any room she entered. In a boardroom, in a meeting, in a negotiation, she never let herself be the one who was already being watched when the other person walked in. She preferred to be the one doing the watching. The hostess had seated her without incident, but the table was positioned in a section of the dining room that was, she noticed immediately, slightly elevated, slightly visible. The kind of placement that was either thoughtful or deliberate, and in her experience, it was usually deliberate. She'd asked for a booth and been told they were all reserved, so she'd sat. And she'd ordered sparkling water, and she'd tried not to be aware of the couple at the next table, who were both now spending a great deal of energy looking at their menus while clearly not reading them. She knew how to read a room. She'd been reading rooms all her life. By the time Brennan was parking his truck, 2 tables in her immediate vicinity had noticed her. One table, 4 men in their mid-40s, good suits, the easy posture of people who've had money long enough that they don't have to perform it, were speaking quietly, and twice she heard the particular rhythm of sentences that ended in barely concealed amusement. She caught one phrase, "Poor guy doesn't know what he's walking into." She'd heard variations of that sentence her entire adult life. Heard it at charity galas where she was the wealthiest person in the room and also the one who got the fewest dance invitations. Heard it at industry conferences where her name on the agenda drew both attendance and commentary. Heard it at Harvard during her MBA, from classmates who would have killed for her intellect and settled for laughing at her instead. She had a system. She'd built it over years of trial and painful error. You sit straight. You make your face neutral. You do not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing that you heard. You eat your bread and you check your phone and you remind yourself that you have survived every single room you have ever entered, and this one will be no different. But she was tired. That was the truth she never said out loud. Not to her assistant, not to the very few friends she still had, not to Dana, the mutual friend who had been relentlessly warm and quietly persistent about this blind date for almost 2 months. She was 30 years old and she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with work. She built companies. She understood finance the way some people understand music, intuitively, structurally, feeling the shape of numbers before she could articulate the logic. She had turned a struggling tech firm she'd acquired at 24 into Whitmore Dynamics, a global leader in enterprise logistics software with operations in 11 countries. She had done this by being smarter and more relentless than anyone in the room, every room, for 6 years. And she had spent those 6 years being informed in various subtle and unsubtle ways that her worth as a human being was up for debate. So yes, she'd almost left. And then the breadbasket had arrived, because the universe has a sense of humor, and she'd decided to give it 1 more minute. 1 more minute had produced Brennan Vale, slightly damp, visibly wrinkled, walking across the dining room toward her with the unhurried ease of someone who wasn't performing anything, and saying, "I'm glad you didn't leave," like he'd thought about what she might need to hear, and just said it. She filed that away too. The table near theirs, the 4 men in good suits, had started something about 20 minutes before Brennan arrived. His name was Decker, mid-40s, regional VP at an investment bank, the kind of man who knew exactly how good-looking he was and had organized most of his personality around that fact. He'd recognized Celeste the moment she sat down. He'd been at two of the same industry events as her in the past year. "Whitmore," he said quietly to the man beside him, nodding toward her table. The other man, Henderson, looked over, confirmed it, and looked back. "Blind date? Looks like. She doing the app thing or what?" "Mutual friend. I heard something about that." Henderson stirred his drink. "I wonder what the poor bastard's expecting." That was where it started. Quietly, the way most cruelty starts. Dressed up as observation, comfortable inside a joke, shared among men who would have been genuinely offended if you'd called them cruel. Decker had pulled out his phone and sent a message to someone at another table. An acquaintance, another finance type, celebrating a deal that night with colleagues. Within 10 minutes, 3 separate tables in that section of Alara had become loosely aware that Celeste Whitmore was on a blind date and that the man hadn't arrived yet. When Brennan walked in, the wrinkled jacket, the slightly uncertain glance around the room before he found his footing, Decker had said something to Henderson that made him laugh behind his hand. "First one to 20 says he's out of here by 9:30, Henderson said. Decker had glanced at his watch. It was 8:02. "Make it 9, he said. The menus arrived. Brennan looked at his for a moment, then put it down and said, "I'm going to be honest with you. I looked at this menu online before I came, and I don't know what half these words mean." "Which ones?" "Pomme dauphine." "Velouté." "That one." He pointed vaguely at the menu, which she found herself unexpectedly charmed by. The gesture was so unself-conscious. "What's a velouté?" "Basically a cream sauce, French term for a sauce made from stock." "Okay, that wasn't so bad. What's the other one?" "Potatoes, fried, kind of crispy on the outside." "So I could have just ordered the fried potatoes." "You could have just ordered the fried potatoes." He smiled. It was a good smile. Not calculated, not deployed for effect. It just happened on his face. "Tell me about the company," he said. She went still, just slightly. That question. Already. But he kept going. "The logistics software thing. Dana mentioned it. I don't know anything about that industry, but I'm curious how someone ends up deciding that's the thing they want to build." It wasn't, she realized, the question she usually got. She usually got, "So how big is the company?" Or, "What's the revenue looking like?" Or from people who were trying to appear thoughtful, "What's your vision for scaling internationally?" He was asking how she'd ended up here, how she'd chosen this. She set her own menu down. "My father ran a small distribution company," she said. "Nothing impressive, regional, a few trucks, 15 employees. He lost it when I was 12. Not because the business model was wrong, but because the logistics were chaos. He couldn't track inventory, couldn't optimize routes, couldn't get real-time data on anything. He was running a modern company with tools from 20 years earlier. And you watched that happen." "I watched that happen, and I thought—" She paused. Not because she didn't know what came next, but because she was deciding how much to say. "I thought someone should fix that, so that people like him didn't lose what they'd built over something solvable." Brennan was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone waiting for his turn to speak, the quiet of someone actually processing what he'd heard. "Did he ever see what you built?" he asked. "He died before the first product launch." She said it evenly. She'd had 12 years to practice saying it evenly. "But he knew I was working on it." "I'm sorry." 2 words. He didn't dress them up. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. The waiter came. They ordered. Celeste got the duck confit. Brennan ordered the steak, and when the waiter confirmed it came with pommes dauphine on the side, he glanced at Celeste and said, "Fried potatoes," and she pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. "Your turn," she said when the waiter left. Dana told me the basics. Single dad, 8-year-old daughter, but she was vague on the how. Something shifted in his face. Not painful exactly. It was more like the way you look when you pick up something heavy and you know you're going to carry it, but you take a second to get your grip right. "Her name's Mia," he said. "Her mother and we were together for 3 years. She got pregnant and we tried to make it work. But we weren't right for each other, and I think we both knew that before Mia was born, We were just both hoping it would fix itself. He picked up his water glass. It didn't fix itself. When did she leave? Mia was 14 months. She'd been unhappy for a while, honestly. I don't think she'd wanted it the way I'd. Anyway, it doesn't matter. She moved to Seattle. She's got a life there. She sends Mia birthday cards. Birthday cards. Birthday cards. Celeste looked at him. Is that hard for Mia? It was, for a while. She went through a phase around first grade where other kids were talking about their moms, and she'd come home and ask me questions I didn't always know how to answer. He set down the water glass. I tried to be honest without making her feel like she was missing something. I'm not sure I always got the balance right. You never know when you're doing it if you're doing it right. You just keep going. That sounds exhausting. He looked slightly surprised, like he'd expected something softer. Yeah, he said. It is. Not in a way I'd change, but yeah. What is she like, Mia? He sat back, and something in his whole posture opened, the way a person opens when they've been handed a subject they're genuinely comfortable with, that they don't have to manage or perform. Space, he said, like obsessively. Planets, stars, black holes. She made me take her to the planetarium 4 times last year. She explains things to me now. She'll come home from school and deliver a full lecture on gravitational waves like I'm the one who needs to catch up. He shook his head, and the affection in it was something that couldn't be manufactured. She wants to be an astronaut, which statistically is not the most likely outcome, but I'm not going to be the one to tell her that. Why not? Because she's 8, and she's right that it's possible, and nobody told her it wasn't, so she's walking around just planning it, like it's a thing that's going to happen. He glanced up. I think about that sometimes. What it was like to be that certain about something, before you understand the odds. Celeste was quiet for a moment. I still have that, she said finally. The certainty. I don't know if that's a gift or a problem. Probably both. Probably. Dropped it. At 9:07, Decker glanced at his watch, and then at Celeste's table. They were still there. More than that, there was something about the way they were sitting that hadn't been there when the evening started. The woman across the table from Brennan Vale was leaning forward slightly, elbows on the table, and she was talking. Not performing, not managing, talking. Henderson had gone quiet. Decker's phone buzzed. One of the other tables asking for an update. He typed back, "Still going." The response came back almost immediately. "No way." And then, "What is she doing?" He put his phone face down. He didn't like the answer to that question, and he couldn't quite name why. The food arrived. They ate. They talked. She told him about the mechanics of logistics software, and somewhere halfway through the explanation, he asked a question that was sharp enough that she looked at him sideways. "How do you know about last-mile distribution problems?" she asked. "I manage inventory for an auto shop. I use 3 different systems that don't talk to each other, and every week something's in the wrong place." He speared a piece of steak. "It's not exactly enterprise scale, but the frustration is the same." "It's exactly the same," she said. "The scale is different. The frustration is identical. So fix that. Build the small business version. We have a small business tier." "Does it actually work?" She opened her mouth, then stopped. Because the honest answer was, it worked better than it used to and worse than it should. And nobody at Whitmore Dynamics had asked that question in exactly those words in a very long time. "I'm going to have a meeting on Monday because of you," she said. "I'll add that to my list of accomplishments." She laughed. It came out before she could calibrate it, louder than she intended, real enough that the couple at the nearest table looked over. She didn't care. He told her about the shop, about starting as a mechanic at 19, about working for someone else for 7 years, about scraping together enough money to lease a small space in Pilsen at 27 with his friend Colby, who was a better businessman than Brennan and a worse mechanic. "How long have you had it?" 5 years in September." He said it with the particular pride of someone who had expected, maybe even been told, it wouldn't last that long. "Is it hard doing that and raising Mia?" "Yes," he said, without hedging it. "Every single day there's something I'm not doing right. Either the shop needs something and I leave late and she's the last kid at aftercare, Or she needs something and I lose a half day and Colby picks up my slack and doesn't complain about it, which almost makes it worse. He set down his fork. I'm basically always behind. On something. You don't seem like it. What does it seem like? He wasn't fishing. He was genuinely curious. Celeste considered it, like someone who knows which things actually matter. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his fork again. That's the most generous interpretation of disorganization I've ever heard. I run a company. I've learned to look for the skill under the chaos. And what's the skill under mine? Priority. She reached for her wine. You know what you'd give up last. Most people don't. At 9:40, the waiter asked if they'd like to see the dessert menu. They had both forgotten to leave. Brennan said yes. Celeste looked at the menu and ordered the chocolate fondant. Brennan ordered the same because he didn't know what else was on there, and it sounded uncomplicated. Tell me something people don't usually ask you, he said. She looked up. What kind of question is that? Genuine one. You spend a lot of time being asked about the company. I'm trying to find the other parts. She looked at him for a moment, then, what was the last thing that made you actually happy? Not satisfied. Happy. That's my question for you. I'm redirecting. I noticed, but he answered it. 2 weeks ago, Mia had a science project. She built a model of the solar system out of clay. It took 3 nights, and the kitchen looked like a disaster zone, and she painted Jupiter wrong the first time and had to redo it. He paused. And when she was done, she brought it to the table and she looked at it like she'd built the actual solar system, like it was the most complete thing in the world. He shook his head. That's what it was. Celeste had gone still again, not the careful stillness of before. Something else. Your turn, he said. She was quiet for a moment. I don't think I have an answer to that question right now. Okay? That's not a deflection. I'm being precise. I can't think of the last time I felt that specific thing. Happy isn't a word I use very often for myself. She said it matter-of-factly, not as a bid for sympathy. What word do you use? Effective, she said. Productive. Solved. He was quiet for a moment. Those aren't the same. No, she agreed. They're not. The dessert came and went. At some point, Celeste looked up and noticed that the dining room had thinned. Several tables were empty that hadn't been before. She'd lost track of the men in good suits entirely, which was the first time in recent memory that she hadn't remained acutely aware of every potential source of judgment in her vicinity. She looked at her phone. 10:48. I have a 7:30 call, she said. Tomorrow. I do not usually stay out this late on a weeknight. Neither do I. He looked at his own phone, seemed mildly surprised by the time. I told my mom I'd be back by 11. Your mom's watching Mia. She loves it. She gets to spoil her and then hand her back. He reached for his jacket. I'm going to pay. Split, she said. I was raised differently. I make significantly more money than you, and I'm aware of the symbolism of letting you pay, so we're splitting it. He looked at her. Then he said, Okay. She flagged the waiter. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sidewalk was wet, the streetlights leaving long, smeared reflections on the pavement, and the air had gone cool and clean in the particular way it only does after a real storm. They stood just outside the entrance while the valet brought her car around. This was... she started. Yeah, he said. I don't usually... Neither do I. She looked at him. That's very annoying. Finishing your sentences? Doing it accurately. He smiled. The good one. Dana's going to want a full report. I'm going to give her as little information as possible. Same. He paused. I'd like to do this again, if that's something you want. She looked at him for a moment, and then she did something she almost never did, which was answer a personal question without running it through any kind of filter first. Yes, she said, I want that. Her car arrived. She opened her own door before the valet could get there, old habit, and got in. Through the window, she could see Brennan standing on the wet sidewalk in his wrinkled jacket, hands in his pockets, watching her go with no particular expression except the comfortable one of someone who is not pretending to feel something they don't. She pulled out into the street. And 3 blocks later, alone in the car with the city lights blurring past, she put one hand over her mouth and sat with the feeling she didn't have a word for. Not effective. Not solved. Something she'd stopped expecting to feel a long time ago, quietly tucked away and half forgotten. Something that felt, and she held the word at arm's length, suspicious of it, aware of all the ways it could be wrong, like possibility. Back inside, Decker was signing the check. Henderson had already put on his coat. The other tables they'd communicated with had mostly cleared out. The whole low joke of the evening, the bets, the commentary, the smugness of men who found suffering amusing as long as it wasn't theirs, had wound down without a clear ending. "Huh," said Henderson. Decker didn't answer. "She looked," Henderson started. "Don't," said Decker. "I'm just saying that—" "I know what you're saying." He picked up his jacket. "Leave it." They walked out without further comment. Behind them, the waiter cleared the last table in that section and blew out the small candle, and the table where Celeste Whitmore had spent an evening being genuinely surprised went dark. Brennan drove home with the radio off. The streets were slick and quiet, most of the city folded in for the night, and he took the long way without meaning to. Missed a turn, didn't bother correcting, just kept going through the lit-up emptiness of downtown at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday. He thought about the way she'd answered his questions. Not the content of the answers, though that too, but the quality of how she answered. Precise. She chose every word with intention, the way you do when you've learned that words misread can do real damage. He thought about what she'd said. "I can't think of the last time I felt that specific thing." He knew what that was. He'd been there. After Mia's mother left, after the first brutal year alone with a toddler and a shop that barely broke even, and a very specific silence in the apartment at night that was worse than noise, he'd gone a long time without happy. Surviving, yes. Managing, yes. Sometimes even laughing. But that clean, specific thing Mia gave him when she looked at her clay solar system, he'd lost that for a while. He'd been lucky. Mia had given it back. He wondered who had given Celeste the idea that she didn't get to have it. He pulled into his mother's driveway at 11:16. The lights were still on. His mother was probably watching something on television, running out the clock on being needed. He sat in the truck for just another moment. Dana texted. "Dana, well?" He looked at the message. "Brennan, I'll call you tomorrow." Dana. Brennan. Dana, call me right now. Right now. Dana, I am not a patient woman. He put the phone in his pocket and went inside. In the living room, his mother was on the couch and Mia was asleep against her shoulder, mouth slightly open, one sock on and one sock inexplicably missing, the way children sleep when they've fully surrendered to it. His mother looked up, read his face, and said nothing. She was smart that way. He picked Mia up. She stirred, grabbed his collar without waking, settled against his chest, and carried her out to the truck. "Good night?" he asked him. "Yeah," he said. "Actually, yeah." He drove home through the wet and quiet city with his daughter asleep in the back seat, the windows fogged slightly at the edges, the radio still off. He didn't have a word for it either, but it felt like the beginning of something. And for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare him. They saw each other again the following Saturday. Not a restaurant this time. Brennan's idea, which Celeste had agreed to with a speed that surprised her afterward. He texted Thursday morning. "Mia wants to see the new exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry. I know that sounds like a terrible second date, but I thought you might want to come if you're not busy." No pressure. Then, 4 minutes later? That was a weird ask. Forget it. Then, 2 minutes after that, actually, don't forget it. I meant it. She'd read all 3 texts in sequence and felt something loosen in her chest. Not because the invitation was impressive, because it wasn't trying to be. "I'll be there," she'd written back. She met them at the main entrance at 10 in the morning. Mia was wearing a jacket covered in small embroidered planets, Saturn on the left sleeve, a red Jupiter over her heart, and was already studying the map of the exhibits before Celeste had finished saying hello. She had Brennan's directness and her own singular energy, the kind that doesn't know yet to dim itself for a room. "You're Celeste," Mia said without looking up from the map. "I am." "Dad said you run a company." "I do." "What kind?" Software. We help businesses manage how they move things from one place to another. Mia considered this briefly. That sounds complicated. It is. Do you like it? The question landed with the particular weight that only very direct children can produce. Celeste looked at Brennan, who was watching with the specific expression of a parent who has learned not to intervene. Most of the time, Celeste said. Mia finally looked up. She had very serious eyes, brown, like her father's, but with something more impatient in them. That's honest, she said, and turned back to the map. Dad likes the car part of his job, but not the bookkeeping. That's also honest, Celeste said. Brennan made a face. Mia. It's true. It's private. She's not going to tell anyone. Mia folded the map with the authority of someone who has already decided where they're going. Okay, black holes first, come on. She walked ahead. Brennan fell into step beside Celeste, and she could feel him trying not to smile. She's like that with everyone I saw, he said. Fair warning. I noticed. Still want to stay? Celeste looked at the back of Mia's planet jacket moving confidently through the morning crowd. Yes, she said, and meant it twice over. They spent 3 hours in the museum. Mia lectured both of them on neutron stars with a thoroughness that left no room for interruption, asked the exhibit staff a series of questions that required 2 of them to confer before answering, and ate half of Brennan's sandwich at lunch without asking. Celeste bought her a small book on astrophysics from the gift shop, which Mia took with both hands and examined the back cover of with the same seriousness she gave everything. I already know some of this, she said. I assumed, Celeste said. There's a chapter near the back on black hole thermodynamics. I thought that part might be new. Mia looked up sharply. You know about black hole thermodynamics? Not much. I know Hawking radiation exists and that it means black holes aren't actually permanent. Beyond that, I'd need the book. Mia stared at her for another full second. Then she opened the cover and started reading. Brennan, beside Celeste, said very quietly, You just passed some kind of test. I know, she said, equally quiet. She doesn't do that with most people. Neither do I. He glanced at her, and the thing between them that had started at a candlelit table on a rainy Tuesday was still there, in the flat afternoon light of a museum cafeteria surrounded by school groups and stroller traffic. Not diminished by the ordinary setting, just present, like weather you don't need to explain. They saw each other again the week after that, then the week after that. It wasn't dramatic, it didn't announce itself. Brennan drove to her building one evening with takeout because she'd mentioned she hadn't eaten since noon and it was 7:30. She showed up at the shop one Wednesday afternoon with coffee and Mia's forgotten library book, which she'd swung by the school to collect because she'd been 2 blocks away in a meeting and Brennan had texted in a mild panic. She didn't make a thing of it. He didn't either. That was the rhythm of it. Quiet, practical, real. She met Colby, who shook her hand and immediately asked if she knew anyone looking for fleet management software. She said she'd forward him a contact. She did. He sent her a thank you text in all caps 2 days later, which she showed Brennan and they both laughed about. She started calling on Sunday evenings, originally just to talk, eventually because Mia had started requesting it. Mia would appear in the background of whatever Brennan was doing and say something like, "Is that Celeste?" and then simply take the phone, and they'd have a 10-minute conversation about whatever Mia was currently obsessed with. Hawking radiation for several weeks, then orbital mechanics, then a phase about whether there was ice on Europa that went on longer than anyone expected. Celeste, who had spent 6 years speaking to boards and investors and analysts, found these conversations unexpectedly easy. Mia didn't want impression. She wanted information and someone willing to take her seriously. Celeste could do that. What she couldn't do, what she was only slowly becoming aware of failing at, was keeping any of it private. The first photograph appeared on a Thursday. It wasn't a good photo. Taken from distance, probably on a phone, slightly blurred. The 2 of them outside a restaurant in Lincoln Park where they'd gone for dinner while Mia was at a sleepover. Celeste hadn't thought about it. She'd been too busy arguing with Brennan about whether Chicago deep dish actually qualified as pizza, which was a fight she had opinions about, and he was being deliberately contrary in a way she was beginning to recognize as his specific version of flirtation. The photo went on a gossip blog first, then it spread. The caption read, Whitmore Dynamics CEO Celeste. Whitmore spotted on date with unidentified man in Lincoln Park. The billionaire executive, known as much for her size as her success, appears to have found a companion willing to overlook the obvious. Who is he, and what is he after? She found out about it at 6 in the morning, when her phone lit up with 17 texts from her communications director, Patrice, in rapid succession. She read them all. Then she put the phone face down and lay in the dark for a moment, willing to overlook the obvious. She'd known it was coming. She always knew. That had never once made it land softer. Patrice was already at the office when Celeste arrived. She was 38, efficient, unflappable in public and blunt in private, which was why Celeste had hired her and why she'd stayed. She had 3 browser tabs open, and she was chewing on a pen cap, which she only did when she was actively suppressing her instinct to fix something by any means necessary. It's not catastrophic, Patrice said. It's clickbait. Low-tier publication, maybe 15,000 unique views, but it's been picked up by 2 aggregators and... She clicked to another tab. Gavin Mercer's assistant liked it. Celeste put down her coffee. Which piece? The blog post. At 5:47 this morning. She turned the monitor slightly. Which means Mercer saw it. Or his assistant has opinions. Mercer hired his assistant specifically because her opinions align with his. Celeste sat. What's his move? I don't know yet. Nothing formal. But he had a call with Henderson yesterday. Decker Henderson, from the investment side, that our investor relations team flagged as unusual. Patrice closed the tabs. He's circling, has been for a while. I know. This gives him something to circle around. I know that too. Celeste looked at her desk. The photo was just a photo. 2 people outside a restaurant. It told you nothing about the conversation inside, nothing about the 3 hours at the museum, nothing about the Sunday evening calls or the coffee runs or the quiet compounding weight of someone simply choosing to show up. It told you what it wanted to, which was all it was designed to do. What do you need from me? Patrice asked. Nothing yet. Monitor it. If it spreads further, let me know. And the man in the photo, they're going to identify him. I know. Celeste, I know, Patrice. She went to her desk and opened her laptop and started her day. She did not call Brennan. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. She spent the rest of that day telling herself that. They identified him by noon. Brennan Vale, 32. Owner and head mechanic at Vale and Colby Auto, a 2-person shop in Pilsen, South Side. Single father to 1 daughter. No notable public profile, no social media presence beyond a business page with 15 reviews, 4 of which mentioned he'd stayed late to finish a job and not charged extra for it. The headlines that followed were not kind. Whitmore Billions, regular guy body shop, billionaire, CEO's new love interest revealed. What does Chicago's richest woman see in a grease monkey? We asked an expert. They had not, in fact, asked an expert. Celeste Whitmore's new man, gold digger or just lucky? That last one made him sound almost admirable, which she found somehow worse. Tuck, she called him that evening. Her hand was unsteady when she did it, which she registered with the mild dissociation of someone who is used to watching themselves be afraid from a safe distance. He picked up on the second ring. Background noise. He was still at the shop. You saw, she said. Not a question. Yeah. A pause. The sound of something being set down. About 4 hours ago. Colby texted me the photo before I even got a chance to look at my own phone. I'm sorry. For what? For the... She stopped. The coverage. The way they wrote about it. About you. Which part? The grease monkey thing or the gold digger speculation? Her jaw tightened. Both. I've been called worse. He said it easily, which made her angrier on his behalf. I'm not worried about what strangers on the internet think of me. It doesn't bother you? It bothers me that they wrote about you the way they did. His voice had shifted, quieter, harder. That overlook the obvious line. What does that even... He stopped. You didn't deserve that. She hadn't expected that to be his first response. She'd expected reassurance, something practical, something aimed at making her feel better, not anger, not on her account. Brennan, no, I mean it. I know you're used to it, and that's the thing that actually... He stopped again. She heard him exhale. You shouldn't have to be used to it. She sat very still. This is going to get worse before it gets better, she said finally. If we keep seeing each other, the coverage, the commentary, I have people at my company who are already using it as ammunition. Silence on the line. What are you asking me? He said. I'm not asking you anything. I'm telling you what the situation is. Okay? And I'm asking what you're asking me, because that sounded a lot like you building a case for something. She pressed her fingertips to the edge of her desk. I just think you should understand what this looks like from the outside. I don't care what it looks like from the outside. You should. Celeste. His voice was very level. Are you trying to talk me out of this? She didn't answer immediately, which was, she knew, its own kind of answer. I'm trying to be honest with you, she said. Then be honest. Not careful. Honest. She closed her eyes. In the dark behind her eyelids, she was sitting in a car 3 blocks from Alara on a rain-slicked street, one hand over her mouth, holding something she didn't have a word for. I'm scared, she said. It came out smaller than she intended. That's honest. Of what? Of... She stopped, started again. Of what happens when it stops being new. When you've seen enough of the way the world reacts to me, and you realize what you signed up for. When it's not exciting anymore, it's just expensive, socially. A long pause. Celeste, Brennan said, I raised a kid by myself for 7 years. I have a business that's been 6 months from going under at least twice. I drive a 12-year-old truck that I fix myself because I can't afford the markup at another shop. She could hear him moving, the particular sounds of a garage at the end of the day, the click of a light switch. I don't have a lot of things, but I know exactly what I signed up for, and I haven't seen anything yet that makes me want to stop. She didn't speak. I'm not going anywhere, he said, but I need you to stop looking for reasons I should. The silence after that was the kind that changes something. Not dramatic, just settled. Okay, she said. Okay. Enette. What she didn't tell him, what she didn't tell anyone yet, was that the board was moving. She'd known Gavin Mercer was a problem since the day he joined the board 3 years ago, carried in on the strength of a recommendation from an investor group that held 12% of shares. He was 51, impeccably polished, and operated with the particular confidence of a man who had decided very early in life that the world was organized around people like him and had never encountered sufficient evidence to the contrary. He'd spent 3 years building alliances on the board. Quiet dinners, golf games, the careful cultivation of men who were not hostile to Celeste, but who could be made uncertain about her. Uncertainty, in corporate governance, was almost as good as opposition. His thesis, which he'd never stated directly, because he was too strategic for that, was that Celeste Whitmore was a liability, that her public profile created friction with certain investors, that her leadership style was too instinctive, too personal, not sufficiently aligned with the image of a serious global enterprise. He had never once, in 3 years, said the words her weight or her appearance in a boardroom. He didn't have to. He said optics. He said market perception. He said the kind of CEO-level brand alignment that reassures institutional investors. It was the same sentence with better vocabulary. The photographs had given him something concrete, not proof of anything. There was nothing wrong with Celeste having a personal life, but proof of exposure. Proof that she was visible in ways that could be framed as problematic. A billionaire CEO photographed on dates with a mechanic from the South Side. Fodder for gossip blogs. Commentary on social media. Exactly the kind of noise that made certain board members pull slightly away from their certainty. His assistant had liked the blog post at 5:47 in the morning because Gavin Mercer had told her to. It was a small thing, a signal. The kind of move that looks like nothing and means everything. The week after the photos, two more appeared. One was from outside the Museum of Science and Industry. Someone had recognized Celeste and taken a photo at a distance. It showed the three of them, Celeste, Brennan, and Mia, walking across the parking lot, Mia between them, her hand in Brennan's. The angle made it look like they were a family, because they had looked like a family. This one spread faster. The commentary split in a way that surprised her. Some of it was what she expected, pointed, unkind, the usual architecture of cruelty dressed as observation. But some of it wasn't. Some of it was people saying, wait, hold on, and actually this is kind of sweet, and who is this guy, and why is he looking at her like that? She didn't read the kind comments. She couldn't trust herself to. It was easier to brace for the bad ones because the bad ones she knew how to process. The good ones made her feel something that was much harder to defend against. 3 reporters showed up at Vail and Colby on a Wednesday morning. Brennan was midway through a brake job on a 2019 Accord when Colby appeared at the bay door with an expression that Brennan had seen exactly twice before. Once when the shop's bank account went to 4 figures, once when a supplier sent them the wrong parts for a fleet job and they had 12 hours to fix it. "There are people outside," Colby said. Brennan wiped his hands on a rag. "What kind of people?" "Press kind." He looked at Colby for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and saw 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize and a text from his sister that just said, "Brennan, please call me with the particular punctuation of someone who has been waiting to deploy it." He went outside. There were 2 photographers and a woman with a recorder who introduced herself as being from a publication he'd heard of but never read. She had the practiced casual posture of someone who'd done a lot of ambush journalism and was very good at making it seem like a friendly conversation. "Mr. Vail, just a few questions about your relationship with Celeste Whitmore. I don't have anything to say." "Are you two?" "No comment." He turned to go back inside. "Mr. Vail, there are reports that Ms. Whitmore's board is concerned about the optics of—" He stopped, turned back. "What did you say?" The reporter, and to her credit, she didn't flinch, repeated it. "There are reports that members of the Whitmore Dynamics board have raised concerns about the optics of the relationship." He stood there at the door of his shop, in his work clothes, in the place he'd built for 7 years with his own hands and Colby's, and he looked at this reporter and the 2 photographers and the recorders and the telephoto lenses, and he thought about a woman sitting alone at a table in a restaurant while strangers placed bets on her humiliation. He thought about willing to overlook the obvious. He thought about Mia in her planet jacket and the book on astrophysics and the way she'd looked at Celeste like she'd passed a test worth passing. "This is a garage," he said. "We fix cars. Tell your publication that." And he went back inside. Colby found him at the workbench 20 minutes later. "You okay?" Colby asked. "Fine." "You look like you're torquing that bolt harder than it needs." Brennan put down the wrench. "I'm fine." Colby sat on the edge of the workbench, which Brennan had told him 100 times not to do, and said nothing for a while, which was one of the things Brennan valued most about him. Colby knew how to be quiet. "She know you got ambushed this morning?" Colby asked finally. "Not yet." "You gonna tell her?" "Yes." "Is she—" Colby stopped, chose his words with slightly more care than usual, which for Colby was notable. "Is it worth it? Whatever this is?" Brennan looked at the car he was supposed to be finishing. Outside, the photographers were probably still there. "Yeah," he said. "It is." Colby nodded slowly. "All right." He got off the workbench. "I'll cover the front if they come back." Brennan picked up the wrench. "Colby?" "Yeah." "Thanks." "You do the same." He disappeared back toward the front, and Brennan could hear him, not words, just tone, talking to someone outside with a particular quality of politeness that left no room for argument. He went back to the brake job, and when he was done, he called Celeste. She picked up on the first ring, which told him she'd been waiting. "I heard," she said before he could speak. "I figured." "Brennan, I'm sorry. They shouldn't have come to your—" "Stop apologizing." His voice came out sharper than he meant it to. He softened it. "Stop. It's not your fault they showed up here. It's my life that brought them there. And I'm in your life. That means something. He set the wrench down. Now listen, someone told that reporter about your board, about the optics conversation. That's not a leak from the outside. That's someone inside your company feeding stories. Silence on the line. I know, she said. Her voice had gone quiet and precise in a way that he recognized now. The particular control she deployed when something had rattled her and she wasn't ready to show it. How long has this been happening? Long enough. Celeste, I'm handling it. He wanted to push. He didn't, because he'd learned in a relatively short time that pushing Celeste Whitmore when she said I'm handling it was the specific wrong move. What she needed then wasn't pressure. She needed someone to stand next to her, not push her forward. Okay, he said, but I want to know. When you're ready to tell me, I want to know what's actually going on. A pause, then, I know. That's not yes. No, she said, it's not yet. He accepted that. For now. Outside the shop, the photographers had gone. Colby had apparently told them the parking area was private property with enough conviction that they'd believed him. The street was quiet in the mid-afternoon, just traffic and a kid on a bicycle and the flat city light coming in sideways through the open bay door. Brennan leaned against the workbench. In the phone, he could hear Celeste breathing. Just that. Present on the other end of the line. Hey, he said. Hey. Come to the shop sometime. I'll show you what I do. A small pause. You want me to come to a garage? You showed me the science museum. Different context, same idea. He could hear something shift in her breath. Not quite a laugh. Closer to the thing before the laugh, yeah. The moment when something gets through the careful exterior and she hasn't decided yet if she's going to let it. Okay, she said. Yeah? Yeah. A pause. Brennan. Yeah? I'm glad I didn't leave either. He stood in his garage alone and didn't say anything for a moment. Me too, he said finally. The sun was going low outside and the shop smelled like oil and metal and the particular staleness of a long working day, and none of that was the setting for anything romantic. There were no cameras here, no candlelight, no upscale restaurant staging an atmosphere. Just a man leaning against a workbench at the end of a hard day, talking to a woman he hadn't expected to meet, in a city that was already trying to decide what their story meant before they'd had a chance to figure it out themselves. He stayed on the line. So did she. The shareholder summit was 6 weeks out when Gavin Mercer made his first formal move. It came as a memo. 12 pages, single-spaced, circulated to the full board at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday with the kind of precision that told you it hadn't been written that morning. It had been waiting, revised, timed. The subject line read, Leadership Continuity and Public Perception, a strategic assessment for Q4 and beyond. It never mentioned Celeste by name in the first 4 pages. It didn't have to. Every metric it cited, every concern it raised, every carefully constructed sentence about executive-level brand coherence and the relationship between personal conduct and investor confidence was aimed at one person, and everyone on that board knew it. Patrice had it on Celeste's desk before 8. Celeste read it twice. The first time fast, looking for the argument. The second time slow, looking for the parts that were true. There were parts that were true. That was the thing about Gavin. He wasn't stupid. He built his cases on foundations that had some structural integrity, because a case built entirely on lies was too easy to knock down. Stock volatility was real, though its causes were more complicated than he'd represented. Certain institutional investors had expressed hesitation, though the hesitation had preceded the photographs by months. The board cohesion metrics he cited were accurate, though he'd done a significant amount of the work to erode that cohesion himself. She put the memo down and called an emergency meeting of her own. Not the full board, her people. The ones she'd built the company with, the ones who'd been there before it was worth anything. Her COO, Marcus Webb, 53, who'd come from logistics consulting and had a gift for seeing organizational problems the way a doctor reads an X-ray. Her CFO, Diane Reyes, who was 46 and had an almost physical intolerance for bullshit. Her general counsel, Ray Okoro, who spoke slowly and never said anything he hadn't thought through completely. They sat around the small conference table in Celeste's office, not the big boardroom, and she slid the memo across to them without comment and waited. Marcus read the fastest. He set it down first, folded his hands, and looked at the ceiling. Diane read it slower, making almost no expression, which was never a good sign. She was expressive by default. The absence of expression meant she was containing something. Ray read it cover to cover, turned back to page 3, read a specific paragraph again, and then set it down. He's calling for a confidence vote, Ray said. He's framed it as a strategic review, but the mechanism he's proposing in Section 7 is functionally a confidence vote. I know, Celeste said. At the shareholder summit. I know. That gives us 6 weeks. I know, Ray. Marcus rubbed his jaw. He's got 4 board members solid, possibly 5 if Huang comes over. And Huang's been quiet lately, which isn't comfort. We need 7 to block him, Diane said. We have 5 reliable, 6 if Okafor holds. Okafor will hold, Celeste said. You sure? He built half his early portfolio on our Series B. He's not burning that down for Gavin Mercer's ambition. Marcus nodded slowly. What about the memo itself? Do we respond formally? Not yet. Responding gives it weight. Celeste stood and walked to the window. The city was gray this morning, low cloud cover, the lake invisible from this angle. We find what he used to build this. We trace every data point back to its source. If he manipulated the reporting, and I think he did, I want proof before that summit. Diane. How far back do you want to go? As far as we need to. The room was quiet for a moment. Celeste, Marcus said. He had the tone of someone who has been waiting to say something and has decided the moment is now. The photographs. The press. Is there anything personal here that we need to factor in? I'm not asking to pry. I'm asking because Gavin's going to use everything. She turned from the window. She looked at Marcus for a moment. At all of them. These 3 people who had been with her since before the company had a second floor, before the Series A, before the contracts that made Whitmore Dynamics something people outside Chicago had heard of. His name is Brennan, she said. He's a good man, and Gavin is not going to get to use him as ammunition. She said it with the particular finality that her team had learned over 6 years was not the beginning of a discussion. Marcus nodded once. Diane opened her laptop. Then let's find what Gavin's been hiding. That's it. She didn't tell Brennan about the memo. She told herself it was because it wasn't his problem to carry. That was true. She told herself it was because she was still gathering information and there was nothing actionable to share yet. That was also true. What she didn't tell herself, what she knew underneath the logistics of it, in the place she didn't usually look too closely, was that she was scared of what his face would look like when he understood the full scale of what was happening, not scared that he'd leave. She'd mostly stopped waiting for that, scared of the moment when it became undeniably real to him that being connected to her had a cost, a concrete, visible, damaging cost. She'd spent her whole adult life making sure her problems were entirely hers to carry. That was a hard habit to unlearn. They had dinner at her place that Friday. She cooked, which she was adequate at, but not impressive. She'd told him that up front, and he'd said he'd manage expectations, which had made her feel something she still didn't fully have vocabulary for. He brought wine and the wrong kind because he'd asked the guy at the shop what to get, and the guy at the shop apparently had strong opinions about California Cabernet that turned out to be specific to the guy's own taste. They drank it anyway. Mia was with his mother. The apartment was quiet. They were on the couch after dinner, and she was telling him about a logistics contract they'd landed in Singapore, and she realized midway through the sentence that she was doing the thing where she filled space with professional information because professional information was safe, because nobody could hurt you with your own competence. She stopped mid-sentence. What? He asked. I'm doing it again. Doing what? Talking about work because it's easier. He looked at her for a moment. Then he set down his wine. Okay, what's the harder thing? She looked at her hands, at the apartment that was very nice and very tidy, and very much a place she'd designed to feel like a sanctuary, and that had always felt, in some way she'd never named, like a stage set, a place she maintained rather than inhabited. The board is moving against me, she said. Formally. One of the members, Gavin Mercer. He's been building a case for months. He wants to force a confidence vote at the shareholder summit. Brennan was very still. And the photos, she continued. Us. He's using them as part of the argument that my judgment is compromised, that I'm a liability. She said it flatly. The way she'd trained herself to say difficult things, direct, without performance, without letting the shape of the sentence tell you how to feel about it. How long have you known? He asked. The memo came Tuesday. No. How long have you known he was building this? A pause. A while. How long is a while, Celeste? She looked at him. Since before we met. He absorbed that. Then, and you didn't tell me about the memo because it's not your problem. That's not... He stopped. Restarted. You know I've been aware something was going on for weeks. You get off the phone sometimes and you've got this. You close everything down, your whole face changes. I didn't push because I was waiting for you to be ready. His voice wasn't angry exactly. It had the tone of someone who has been patient and is now being honest about what the patience cost. But I'm not a complication you have to manage around, Celeste. I'm supposed to be the person you talk to. She felt that land, felt exactly where it landed. I'm not good at that, she said. I know. I'm not asking you to be perfect at it. I'm asking you to try. She was quiet. Outside the window, the city moved. Headlights, the distant groan of traffic, the ordinary persistence of a Friday night in a big city that had no idea what was happening in any particular apartment. He's going to go after you directly, she said, at the summit. He'll use the photographs, the press coverage. He'll frame it as evidence of poor judgment, that my personal choices undermine the company's credibility. She kept her eyes on the window, which means people are going to be looking at you, talking about you, deciding what you mean. Let them. Brennan, I mean it. Let them decide whatever they want. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What I care about is what happens to your company, to the people who work there. Is he actually going to be able to take it from you? She turned from the window, looked at him. He was asking the real question, not the adjacent one, and that specificity did something to the wall she was trying to maintain around the whole subject. Not if I can help it, she said. We're looking at his methodology. The data he used in the memo, I think he manipulated some of the reporting. If I can prove that before the summit, the confidence vote falls apart. What do you need? I need 6 weeks and a forensic accountant. I know a guy, he said. She stared at him. I'm not joking. Colby's brother-in-law, he does forensic accounting for a law firm downtown. He's done a couple of fraud cases. Colby says Brennan, I have a legal team. I know, but sometimes you need someone your legal team doesn't know about. He said it with the calm practicality of someone who has navigated enough systems sideways to understand that formal channels aren't always the fastest ones. Just an option. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something almost disorienting about it. The idea that this man, in this apartment, on a Friday with the wrong wine, was sitting next to her and thinking about how to help her win. Not as a romantic gesture, not as a way to insert himself into her world, just because it was a problem, and he was the kind of person who looked at problems and thought about solutions. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. I haven't talked to him. I meant... She stopped. Generally. Thank you. Generally. He looked at her, then he reached over and picked up her hand from her lap, which was not something he'd done before. Not like this, deliberate, without a specific context to attach it to. Just her hand in his. You've been carrying this alone for a while, he said. I'm used to it. I know you are. He wasn't arguing, just observing. You don't have to be. She didn't say anything, but she didn't pull her hand back either. But 3 weeks before the summit, Gavin made the second move. He went to the press. Not directly. Gavin never did anything directly. He had a contact at a financial news outlet, a senior writer named Pauland who'd covered the sector for 15 years and who owed Gavin the kind of favor that people owe when a source has kept them relevant for long enough. The story that ran on a Thursday morning was attributed to sources close to the Whitmore Dynamics board, and its headline read, Questions mount over Whitmore CEO's stability ahead of key shareholder summit. The story cited the photographs. It cited a supposed pattern of erratic decision-making in recent quarters, which, when Celeste's team traced it back, turned out to be sourced from a version of the internal reports that had been selectively edited, numbers from one quarter presented against context from a different quarter, in a way that required you to already know what you were looking for to catch it. It also included a quote from an anonymous board member. "We have serious concerns about whether Celeste Whitmore's current personal situation reflects the judgment we need at this level. Her relationship choices are her own business. But when those choices invite this level of public scrutiny, they become the company's business." She read the article at 5 in the morning. Then she forwarded it to Patrice, Ray, and the rest of her team with a single line: "Find me everything." Then she went for a run. She ran 4 miles in the cold, in the dark, in the particular silence of the city before 6 a.m., and she didn't listen to music, and she didn't take her phone, and she ran until the thing in her chest had gone from boiling to manageable. When she got back to her apartment, she showered, and she stood in front of the mirror, and she looked at herself for a long time. She knew this moment. She'd been here before. Not with this specific crisis, but with this specific feeling. The feeling that the world had looked at her and found again that it had opinions, that her body, her choices, her life were available for editorial, that she could build something world-class and still have the conversation come back around to whether she was enough, whether she was appropriate, whether the simple fact of her existence was a liability. She'd fought through it before, every time. But she was tired in a way that felt different this time, not defeated. She hadn't been defeated, just thin, like she'd been holding something heavy for so long that her hands had stopped registering the weight. She called Brennan at 7. "Did you see it?" she asked. "Yeah." His voice was rough. She'd woken him. "I saw it." The quote about my personal situation. "I know. I'm sorry you're part of this." A pause. Then, "Celeste, stop apologizing for existing. That's not... It is, though. That's what you're doing." He wasn't sharp about it. He was just clear. Like someone turning on a light in a room you'd been navigating in the dark for so long you'd forgotten the light existed. Every time someone uses us as a target, you apologize. To me. Like you did something wrong by being in a relationship. She sat down on the edge of her bed. "I pulled you into something that's making your life harder." "My life was already hard. It's a different kind of hard now. Some of it's better." He paused. "A lot of it's better." She didn't speak for a moment. "The quote," she said finally, "about judgment, about my personal situation. I need you to know that I don't regret..." "Hey." His voice was quiet. "I know that. You don't have to say it. I want to say it. Okay? I don't regret any of it. Not one dinner, not one Sunday call, not one Tuesday afternoon at your shop watching you explain a carburetor to Mia for 45 minutes. He was quiet for a second. Then she asked very specific questions. She always does. Celeste closed her eyes. "I'm not going to let him win this. I need you to know that. I'm going to fight it. I know you are. But if it gets worse before it gets better, still here," he said, simply. Not as a dramatic declaration, just a fact. The way you'd say the sky is still there if someone asked. It got worse. The story spread through financial news networks. CNBC ran a segment. 2 analysts on opposing panels spent 12 minutes debating the implications for Whitmore Dynamics' Q4 outlook, using phrases like distracted leadership and optics problem without any detectable irony. The stock dipped 4% over 2 days. Not catastrophic, but visible. Enough to give Gavin something to point at. At the office, the atmosphere had changed in the way atmospheres change when people know something is coming but don't know what or when. People were careful. Hallway conversation shortened. Celeste could see it when she walked through. The slight recalibration in people's posture. The split second before someone met her eye. Not disrespect, fear. The particular fear of people who had built their lives around something that now seemed uncertain. She started having individual conversations. Not announcements, Not all hands meetings, just one by one. The people who needed to hear it from her directly. She sat in offices and conference rooms and her own lobby, and she told them, "I'm not going anywhere. We are not going anywhere. Keep doing your job." And she said it like she meant it, because she did, and because the difference between leadership and performance is that leadership is something you do whether or not anyone is recording. Marcus pulled her aside on a Wednesday. "Forensic Review's turning up something." She looked at him. "The Q3 numbers in Gavin's memo. Diane thinks she's found where he got them. A version of the internal variance report that was modified after the initial distribution. Somebody changed the period window and re-exported it, then used the altered version as the source. Can we prove the original was different? If we have the metadata from the document management system, the timestamp should show two versions." Marcus lowered his voice, and Ray's already on it. "How long? A week? Maybe 10 days? The summit was in 18 days. Get it done," she said. The night everything broke open, it was raining again. Not like that first night. This was heavier. A storm system that had come down from Wisconsin and sat over the city like it intended to stay. Brennan texted at 9. "Mia's at Mom's. You okay?" She wasn't. She'd had a board call that evening, one she'd requested, trying to shore up the remaining undecided votes. Two of the members she'd expected to hold had gone quiet in a way that wasn't neutral. Okafor had held, as she'd predicted. But a woman named Ferris, who had been on the board for 4 years and had always been thoughtful and measured, had said something near the end of the call that landed like a stone in still water. "Celeste, I have to be honest with you. I've supported your leadership because I believed in your judgment. What concerns me isn't your personal life. What concerns me is whether you've been distracted from the signals that were there, whether you saw what Gavin was doing and underestimated it." The call had ended shortly after. Celeste had sat in her office for a while without turning on the lights. Ferris was right. That was the unbearable part. She'd seen Gavin building the case, and she'd told herself she had time. She'd been careful about the things she was always careful about: the financial controls, the legal exposure, the board relationships, and she'd underestimated the personal velocity of it. The speed at which one photograph could become a memo, could become a news segment, could become a board member who'd always trusted her suddenly wondering if she was paying attention. She'd underestimated it because she'd been happy. Not distracted. Happy. And some part of her, the part that had spent 30 years waiting for good things to be taken, had been so busy protecting the happiness that she hadn't been protecting the company with the same ferocity she always had. She went home. She stood in her kitchen and didn't cook anything and didn't eat anything, and somewhere around 10:30 she made a decision that she'd been turning over and avoiding for 2 weeks. She was going to step down. Not because Gavin had won, because she'd looked at the board numbers tonight and she was short. She had 6 reliable votes and she needed 7. Ferris had moved to uncertain and Huang was gone. She'd confirmed that privately that afternoon, which meant that at the shareholder summit in 17 days, the vote would fail. And if she stood up there and lost that vote publicly, on an international stage in front of shareholders and press and live stream viewers, it wouldn't just end her leadership of Whitmore Dynamics. It would define her. The narrative would be fixed. A woman who'd let personal choices compromise a company she'd built. The story Gavin had been writing for months would become the only story. She could step down now quietly, on her own terms, and leave with something intact. She turned off the lights in the kitchen. She didn't call Brennan. She turned off her phone, and in the morning she was going to call Ray and tell him to start drafting a resignation letter, because that was the rational decision, and she had always been rational, and that was not going to change. She didn't sleep. At midnight she was sitting in her living room in the dark listening to the rain when her intercom buzzed. She didn't move for a moment. It buzzed again. She went to the panel. "Who is it?" "It's me." Brennan's voice through the intercom, tinny and rain-distorted. "I drove through that." A pause. "Can you let me up?" She pressed the button. He arrived at her door 3 minutes later, his jacket soaked through at the shoulders, water in his hair, looking like someone who had made a decision quickly and not thought through the practical details of it. He was holding a paper bag from a diner on his street that she recognized because she'd been there with him twice. "How did you—" she started. You turned off your phone. He held up the bag. I brought food because it was a thing I could do and I needed to do something. He looked at her. The hallway light caught the particular quality of his face. Worried, direct, entirely without performance. Something happened. She stepped back to let him in. He put the food on her kitchen counter and turned to face her, and she was standing in the middle of her very nice apartment in yesterday's work clothes because she'd never changed, and she hadn't eaten since noon, and she had made a decision in the dark that she believed was rational, and that felt, in the presence of another human being, like surrender. Tell me, he said. So she told him. All of it. The board call, Ferris, Huang, the numbers she needed and didn't have. The decision she'd made. She said it clearly and without drama, the way she said all difficult things, and she watched his face while she said it. He didn't interrupt. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're going to let him take it. I'm choosing to leave before he takes it. That's the same thing." It's not the same thing. Celeste. His voice was careful. Not soft. Careful. The distinction mattered. You built that company from nothing. You built it because you watched your father lose something and you decided you were going to build a world where people didn't have to lose things for fixable reasons. And now somebody who was never in that room with you, who never had a single idea that you didn't already have better, he's scared you into leaving before the fight is over. I'm not scared. You're sitting in the dark at midnight with your phone off. What would you call it? She looked at him. And the thing she almost said, I'd call it strategy. I'd call it protecting myself. I'd call it making the rational choice before the irrational one is made for me, died somewhere before it reached her mouth, because she'd heard what it sounded like from the outside. He got to me, she said quietly. I didn't see it happening, and he got to me. Brennan crossed the kitchen and sat down at her table. He gestured at the chair across from him, the same gesture she'd seen him use with Mia when something needed to be said at eye level. She sat. You told me once, he said, that you started this company because someone should fix the thing that broke your father, that there were people out there running good businesses on broken systems and someone needed to care enough to fix it. He leaned forward. Those people are still in your building. They're going to work tomorrow because you built something worth going to work for. He held her gaze. What happens to them if Gavin Mercer runs it? She already knew the answer to that. She'd known it since the memo. Everything I built gets stripped for parts, she said. He'll restructure. International contracts renegotiated on worse terms because he doesn't understand the relationships. The mid-level team hollowed out. She stopped. The small business tier discontinued. Too niche. Brennan said nothing. He'll take it apart, she said, and put it back together as something smaller and meaner and more profitable in the short term and fundamentally broken within 5 years. Still nothing. She sat with that for a moment, sat with what it meant. I'm 2 votes short, she said. I can't manufacture 2 votes in 17 days. Maybe not, he said, but you haven't found what Mercer was hiding yet either. Marcus thinks they're close. How close? A week, maybe 10 days. That's before the summit. Barely. But before. He sat back. That changes the board math if the manipulation is provable. Ferris moved because she thinks you weren't paying attention. What happens if you can show her that the data she was given was falsified? Celeste looked at him. She thought about Ferris's voice on the call. The specific concern, not that Celeste had made bad decisions, but that she hadn't seen the problem coming. If the problem was built on falsified data, if the evidence of Gavin's manipulation was concrete and verifiable, then Ferris's concern inverted. It wasn't that Celeste had missed something real. It was that she'd been handed a fabricated picture. I need the metadata from the document management system, she said. You said Ray's getting it. I need it faster. She reached across the table and picked up his phone, hers was still off, and dialed Ray's number from memory. It was 12:40 in the morning. Ray picked up on the 4th ring, groggy, and she said, I need the forensic review in 5 days. Tell me what you need to make that happen. A pause on the line, then Ray, very awake suddenly. I'll call the firm tonight. She hung up, set the phone down, looked at Brennan. He reached into the paper bag and pulled out a container of soup and a plastic-wrapped sandwich and put them on the table in front of her with the matter-of-fact practicality of someone performing an act of care that doesn't require annotation. "Eat something," he said. She looked at the soup, then at him. This man who had driven through a storm because she'd turned off her phone and he'd needed to do something. Who had sat in her kitchen at midnight and asked the right questions, and not once said anything about how he felt about any of it. Not to reassure her, not to make himself the subject of the moment. Just present, just there. "You spent your whole life proving your worth to everyone else," he said quietly. "You never realized you already had it." She looked at him, and the things she'd been holding in her chest, the decision, the careful, rational armor of it, the surrender dressed up as strategy, cracked. She pressed one hand over her eyes. Her shoulders went in, and for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, Celeste Whitmore did not hold it together. She cried the ugly way. Not composed, not restrained. The way you cry when something has been pressed down for so long that the release of it is almost violent. Uneven breaths and her hand shaking slightly, and the particular helplessness of not being able to make it look like anything other than what it was. Brennan didn't say anything. He didn't reach over and pat her arm or supply words to fill the space. He just stayed at the table, present and quiet, the way you stay with someone who needs to be in a room with another person without needing that person to fix anything. After a while, she found her breath. She straightened. She was a mess. She knew that, and she was too tired to care. She picked up the soup container and pulled the lid off. "I haven't cried in front of another person in 4 years," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You know? You're surprised every time someone doesn't run." He said it simply, without judgment. "That means you've been expecting them to for a long time." She looked at the soup. Outside the rain was still going, heavy and indifferent, and the city lights made the wet window glow faintly orange, and the apartment that had always felt like a stage set felt, for the first time, like somewhere someone actually lived. "I'm going to fight it," she said. "I know you are. If the metadata comes through, it'll come through." "You don't know that." "No," he said. "But you're not making the call to Ray at 12:40 in the morning if you don't believe it." He leaned back. "You already decided. Before I said anything. You just needed someone in the room while you got there." She looked at him for a long moment. She was going to fight. She was going to walk into that summit in 17 days, and she was going to fight for what she'd built, and she was going to do it knowing she might still lose. She was going to do it anyway. "Eat your sandwich," she said. "You drove through a storm, and you brought me soup, and I'm not going to have you sit here without eating." He reached into the bag. "I was wondering when you'd get there." "I got there." "You always do." He unwrapped his sandwich and took a bite, and outside the rain kept coming, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and that was enough. More than enough. It was the most honest thing she'd felt in years. The metadata came through on a Thursday morning, 4 days before the summit. Ray called at 6:47 a.m., and Celeste was already awake, already at her kitchen table with coffee she hadn't drunk, already running the board math for what felt like the 100th time. She picked up before the second ring. "We have it," Ray said. She set down the coffee. "Tell me." 2 versions of the Q3 variance report. The original was distributed to the full board on September 14th at 9:12 a.m. A second version was created on October 2nd at 11:51 p.m., 11:51 at night, Celeste, and the period window was changed. Q2 data was substituted for Q3 actuals in 6 of the 9 performance categories. The second version is what appears in Gavin's memo. She was quiet for a moment. Who created the second version? Document management shows it was accessed and modified under Gavin's credentials. His login, his device ID. A pause. We also have email metadata showing the modified version was forwarded to Pauland, the financial journalist, 3 days before the news story ran. From an external account we traced back to Gavin's assistant. "That's tampering with company records," she said. "And the forwarding to press is a material breach of Board Confidentiality Agreement, Section 7, Paragraph 3. And depending on how the SEC reads the dissemination of manipulated financial data, it's potentially something bigger." His voice was steady, deliberate. "Ray Okoro Careful" was something the office had a name for. "We need to present this to the right people before the summit, not after." I know. She was already thinking through the sequence. Call the SEC's whistleblower line this morning, not as a formal filing yet, just open the channel. I want them aware. Get me a meeting with outside counsel by noon. She stood. And Ray? Who else knows about this right now? You, me, Diane, Marcus. The forensic team. Keep it there. Nobody else. Not a word inside the building until I've talked to outside counsel and we know the exposure. Understood. A pause. Celeste, this is enough. If we put this in front of the board before the summit vote, Gavin's case falls apart. She thought of Ferris, of the board call and the question about judgment, of the stock dip and the news segment, and Brennan at her kitchen table at midnight with soup from a diner he drove through a storm to bring her. It needs to be more than enough, she said. Get me the meeting. She told Brennan that night. She hadn't planned to. She told herself she'd wait until after the summit, until she knew what the outcome was, until she wasn't in the middle of something that could still go wrong in 6 different directions. But he texted to ask how she was doing, and she'd typed back a real answer instead of a managed one, and 20 minutes later he was on her couch, listening to everything. He didn't say much while she talked. He had the qualities she'd noticed from the beginning, the ability to be present without crowding a room. When she finished laying out the forensic evidence and the legal exposure and the remaining board math, he was quiet for a moment. It's real, he said. Yes. Not just procedural. He actually falsified documents. Yes. He let out a slow breath. Not shocked. She'd told him enough over the past weeks that he'd understood the shape of what Gavin was doing. But there was a difference between understanding the outline and hearing the specifics. She watched his jaw tighten and release. What happens to him? That depends on the SEC and whether outside counsel thinks we have enough for a criminal referral. At minimum, removal from the board, civil liability. If the SEC finds the data dissemination to the press was intentional market manipulation, she paused. That's a different conversation. Do you feel... He stopped, restarted. Is there any part of you that feels good about this? That you were right about him? She thought about it honestly. No, she said. I wish I'd been wrong. If I'd been wrong, the company would have been fine and I'd just have had a difficult colleague. She looked at her hands. Being right cost a lot of people a lot of anxiety for 3 months. That's his fault, not yours. I know. It still happened. He nodded. He accepted that. He was good at accepting the distinction between understanding where blame lay and acknowledging that the damage was real regardless. What do you need before Saturday? He asked. She looked at him. Saturday was the summit. 4 days away. 4 days of outside counsel and SEC channels and board conversations and Patrice managing the press narrative and Marcus running point on the shareholder communication and Diane making sure every number in every document was locked and verified. 4 days of the most consequential professional battle of her life. I need you to come, she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it, which was happening more often now. The gap between thinking and speaking had narrowed in his presence in a way she was still adjusting to. To the summit. I know it's not... You'd have to take the day off and Colby would have to cover... Okay, he said. I haven't finished... Celeste. Okay. He looked at her steadily. I'll be there. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded and looked back at her hands and didn't say anything else, because she didn't need to. Oh, the 3 days before the summit were the hardest she'd had since the company's near collapse in year 2, when a primary investor had pulled out 36 hours before close and she'd had to replace the funding in a weekend. That had been a problem of pure logistics, pure numbers, the kind of crisis she was built for. This was different. This had the legal complexity and the human complexity tangled together in ways that couldn't be separated, and every decision in one domain had consequences in the other. Outside counsel confirmed Friday afternoon that the evidence met the threshold for a formal SEC complaint. They filed. The SEC confirmed receipt and indicated they were already aware of Whitmore dynamics, which told Celeste that either a parallel complaint had been filed by someone inside the company or that the dissemination of manipulated data to the press had already attracted regulatory attention. Either way, the mechanism was in motion. She met with Ferris privately on Friday evening, not over the phone. In person, in a conference room with just the two of them, because Ferris deserved that and because some conversations require a room. She laid it all out. The documents, the metadata, the timestamps, the email chain to Poland. She presented it the way she presented everything, methodically, without editorializing, letting the evidence carry its own weight. Ferris listened without expression. Then she looked at the documents for a long moment. "I owe you an apology," Ferris said. "No," Celeste said. "You raised a legitimate concern based on the information you had. If the information had been accurate, your concern would have been correct." "I should have asked more questions before I put Eleanor." She used her first name, which she almost never did. "I didn't call this meeting so you'd apologize. I called it because you're someone whose judgment I respect, and I needed you to know the full picture before Saturday." Ferris looked at the documents again, then at Celeste. "Do you have 7 votes?" "With yours?" "Yes." Ferris picked up the folder, closed it, and set it flat on the table. "Then you have mine." She didn't sleep Friday night. Not from fear, from something closer to the opposite of it, a kind of high-wire alertness, the feeling of being completely in the present tense. She lay in the dark and ran through scenarios and responses and contingencies, and somewhere around 3 a.m. she stopped running scenarios and just lay there and thought about none of it for a while. She thought about her father, his small office that smelled like coffee and cardboard boxes, his hands, which were always a little rough even on weekends because he'd spent enough years moving inventory himself before he had people to do it. The way he'd talked about his company, not as a thing he owned, but as a thing he was responsible for. Like the 15 people who worked for him were a form of stewardship. She'd built something with 947 employees across 11 countries. 947 people who came to work because she'd built something worth coming to. She got up at 5. She made coffee. She stood at the window and watched the city come back to light in the early gray of a November morning, and she thought, "This is mine. I built it, and I am walking into that room today, and I am not leaving it without a fight." The summit was held at the Meridian Center downtown, a conference facility that Whitmore Dynamics had used for 3 consecutive annual summits. 14 floors up, a ballroom-style room configured for 230 shareholders, with overflow viewing in 2 adjacent rooms and a live stream that was expected to reach several thousand. She arrived at 7:30, 2 hours before the session opened. Marcus was already there, jacket on, looking like he'd slept 4 hours and was running on professional obligation and black coffee. He handed her a folder without preamble. "Shareholder communication is locked. Diane's confirmed the numbers. Ray's team is staged in the secondary conference room with the full evidence package, hard copies and digital. Outside counsel is in the building." Security? Building security has been briefed. Off-duty law enforcement on retainer per standard event protocol. He looked at her. "There are also 2 individuals from a federal regulatory body in the building. They arrived 90 minutes ago. Ray let me know." She nodded. She had expected them. The filing had been made. The summit was the logical venue. "How's the room?" she asked. "Gavin arrived at 7. He's in the board prep area with 3 people I don't recognize. 2 of them have the particular look of attorneys. He knows something is coming. He knows we know something. He doesn't know how much." Marcus paused. "How are you?" She looked at him. Marcus had been with her for 6 years. He'd seen the Series A close and the first major contract sign, and the quarter that almost didn't close, and the morning she'd gotten the call that her father was gone, and had come to the office anyway because there was nowhere else she knew how to be. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it simply, without drama. He nodded. "Then let's go build the room." Cholkut. At 8:55, Celeste was standing in the corridor outside the main hall when her phone buzzed. "Brennan, I'm in the lobby. They said I need a badge." She called Patrice, who sorted the badge in 4 minutes. 3 minutes after that, Brennan appeared at the end of the corridor in a suit she hadn't seen before. Dark navy, well-fitted, the kind of suit that suggested someone had gone to some effort without making the effort the point. He'd done something different with his hair. He was carrying a paper coffee cup and looking at the venue with the expression of a man who is very aware of being out of his usual environment and has decided not to care about that. He saw her and walked over. He looked at her. She was in a black dress she'd bought specifically for this. Clean lines, nothing performative. Her hair was done. She was standing with the posture she'd spent 30 years building, the kind that said, "I belong here," because she'd learned early that if you didn't say it with your body, other people would say the opposite. "You look like you're about to go to war," he said. "I am." He handed her the coffee. "I figured you'd already had some, but I brought it anyway." She took it. "Where did you find coffee in this building?" "Lobby. There's a whole setup down there." He glanced toward the hall. "How many people in that room?" 230 shareholders, plus board, plus overflow. She paused. Plus federal observers. He absorbed that. "Okay. You don't have to, I know I don't have to." He looked at her steadily. "I'm going to find a seat and I'm going to be in there. That's it. You're not going to need to think about me." He said it like a practical matter, like he was telling her where he'd parked the car. "You just need to do what you went in there to do." She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "After this is over, we should talk about some things." Something shifted in his face. Not surprised, more like the expression of someone who has been waiting for a door to open and is careful not to walk through it too fast. "Yeah," he said. "We should." "Good." She straightened. The corridor was filling with staff, with shareholders moving through from registration, with the low hum of 200-plus people taking their seats. "Go find somewhere to sit." He went. She turned toward the hall. Gavin Mercer opened the proceedings at 9 o'clock. He was on the board as the senior independent member, which technically gave him authority to convene the session, and he had exercised that authority by constructing the agenda in a way that placed the leadership review item third, early enough to dominate the session, preceded by 2 procedural items that would establish the formal tone without giving Celeste's team an early opening. He stood at the front of the room in a charcoal suit and spoke with the smooth assurance of a man who believed this morning had already been decided. He welcomed shareholders. He thanked them for their participation. He spoke in the measured cadences of someone who'd run these rooms before and knew exactly how to make inevitable things sound reasonable. Celeste sat at the board table. She watched him. She let him speak. Marcus was 2 seats down. Ray was behind her at the support table. Diane was at the far end of the board table, her face doing the absence of expression thing that meant she was containing something large. When Gavin reached the third item, framed in the agenda as Executive Leadership Review, Stability and Strategic Alignment, he turned to the room with the air of a man delivering a diagnosis. "The board has received a comprehensive assessment," he began, "of the leadership dynamics at Whitmore Dynamics over the past 18 months. This assessment raises serious questions about executive judgment, public perception management, and the kind of brand coherence that institutional investors require. Point of order." It was Ray, standing, quietly, as Ray did everything. Gavin stopped. His face did not change, which told Celeste he'd anticipated some form of interruption and had prepared for it. "Mr. Okoro," he said, "the board has received a second document this morning that is material to the leadership review." Ray held up a folder. "Pursuant to board governance rules, all material information must be presented before a vote proceeds. I'd like to enter this into the record." "I'm not aware of any second document. It was sent to all board members at 8:47 this morning." Ray's voice was even, patient. The voice of someone holding 4 aces and in no hurry to show them. "I'll wait for members to retrieve it." A beat of silence, then the sound of phones and tablets being accessed across the board table, across the room. Gavin's composure held. Barely. Celeste could see the calculation behind his eyes. He didn't know what was in the document, but he knew the timing was designed to damage him, and the specific steadiness of Ray's posture told him it was something real. "What is this?" said a board member named Calloway, midway down the table. He was looking at his tablet. His voice had gone flat in a way it hadn't been a minute ago. "A forensic review of the Q3 variance report cited extensively in the strategic assessment memo distributed to this board on behalf of Mr. Mercer," Ray said. "The review establishes with documentary evidence that the version of the report used in that memo was a modified version, created on October 2nd at 11:51 p.m., in which Q2 data was substituted for Q3 actuals in 6 performance categories. The metadata chain of custody is included in Appendix A. The room changed. Not loudly. These were shareholders and board members. People who understood numbers and knew what chain of custody documentation meant, and were already, Celeste could see, running the implications through their own calculations. Gavin said, "This is an internal document matter that has no bearing on—" Appendix B, Ray continued, contains an email chain establishing that the modified version of this report was forwarded to a financial journalist at an external publication 3 days before a news story ran, citing anonymous board sources. The forwarding was made from an external account linked to a device registered to a member of Mr. Mercer's staff. Ray's voice remained entirely even. A formal complaint regarding the dissemination of manipulated financial data has been filed with the SEC. Federal observers are present in this room. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a large room in which something decisive has just happened and everyone is still catching up to it. Gavin stood very still at the front of the room. He had the look of a man watching the architecture of something he'd built very carefully collapse in real time. Not with noise, not with drama, but with the quiet inevitability of a structure whose load-bearing elements have simply failed. "This is fabricated," he said, but the word fabricated had a different weight when the metadata chain of custody was sitting in the hands of 230 shareholders. "The timestamps are from the company's own document management system," Ray said. "The forensic firm's methodology is in Appendix C. Any member of the board is welcome to engage an independent expert to verify the findings. We welcome that." Calloway had stopped reading his tablet. He was looking at Gavin. Ferris, at the far end of the board table, was looking at her own copy of the document with an expression that had gone from neutral to something colder. "I'd like to request a brief recess," said Celeste. She said it simply. Not triumphantly, not with the energy of someone who had won something, with the energy of someone who wanted to give the room a moment to breathe before the next thing happened, because she understood that how you handle the aftermath matters almost as much as the event itself. The session chair, not Gavin, a neutral party appointed for the summit, called a 15-minute recess. The room began to exhale. In the corridor outside, it was Celeste and Marcus and Ray and Diane and the controlled chaos of rapid, quiet decision-making. "Calloway's already talking to Okafor," Marcus said. "I saw it before we stood up." "Huang?" Celeste asked. "Huang's been on his phone since Ray stood up. I don't know who he's calling." "It doesn't matter anymore," Ray said. "The vote question is functionally answered. Gavin's lost the room. The question now is procedure, whether he resigns before the vote or whether we proceed to the formal motion." "He won't resign," Celeste said. "He'll make us vote him out." "Then we vote him out." "Yes." She looked at Ray. "What's the legal exposure on the SEC complaint timeline?" "They move at their own pace. We don't control that. But the filing is logged, the observers were present, the evidence is in the room." He adjusted his glasses. "That part is done." Patrice appeared from the direction of the press area. "Media's picked it up. Someone live tweeted the Ray moment, apparently. It's moving." "Which direction?" "So far? Yours." Patrice, who rarely offered assessments without qualification, said it plainly. "The metadata story is clean. People understand it." Celeste nodded. She looked down the corridor. 30 feet away, through a half-open door, she could see Gavin standing with his 2 attorneys, speaking in low, tight sentences. His posture had changed. The assured smoothness of an hour ago was still there in surface detail. The suit, the set of the shoulders, but the quality underneath it was different now. He was recalculating. She could see it. She felt nothing about that except the particular tiredness of someone who had spent months fighting something that should never have been necessary. Marcus was watching her. "You okay?" "Yes." She looked back toward the hall. "Let's go back in." Bob. The session reconvened. The vote on the leadership review item, which Gavin's own agenda had placed as the centerpiece of the morning, took 11 minutes to resolve. 4 votes in favor of proceeding with the confidence motion, 9 against. including Huang, who Celeste had written off 3 weeks ago, and who met her eyes across the table when his vote was recorded with the expression of a man who had nearly made a very expensive mistake. The subsequent motion, removal of Gavin Mercer from the board pending the outcome of the SEC investigation, passed 8-4. The 4 dissenting votes were the same 4 who'd supported his original motion, which told Celeste everything she needed to know about the shape of the board going forward. Gavin stood when his name was read. His attorneys were in the room. He said nothing. He collected the folder in front of him with measured deliberateness, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the door. He passed within 6 feet of Celeste's seat. He didn't look at her. 2 federal observers fell in quietly behind him as he left. The room was absolutely silent for a moment. Then someone started speaking, a shareholder near the back asking a procedural question about the Q4 roadmap, and the morning moved forward, as mornings do, regardless of what has happened in them. She found Brennan afterward in the corridor outside the main hall. He was standing against the wall with his arms folded and the patient, slightly worn look of someone who has been sitting in an unfamiliar room for 2 hours running on someone else's adrenaline. When he saw her, he straightened. She walked up to him. She didn't say anything for a second. She was still in summit mode, the professional composure that had been holding everything in place since 5 a.m., and it was going to take a minute for that to come down. He looked at her face. "You won," he said. "We won," she said. "The evidence won." "Same thing." "It's not the same thing." "Celeste." She looked at him. "You won," he said again, simply, like it was important that she accept the sentence without qualifications around it. She stood there in the corridor outside a room where she had just held on to the thing she'd spent 6 years building, wearing a dress she'd bought for a fight she'd almost decided not to show up to, and she looked at this man who had driven through a storm and brought her soup and sat at her table at midnight asking the right questions, and the composure she'd been holding since 5 a.m. came down quietly, without drama, like a curtain dropping after the performance is over. She stepped forward and put her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. No commentary. No, I told you so. No, see, I knew it. None of the things that would have made it about him. Just his arm around her in a corridor outside a boardroom, while shareholders filed past and the city moved outside the windows, indifferent and ongoing. "Marcus needs me in about 10 minutes, she said. "I know. There's going to be press." "I figured." "This isn't over. There's the SEC process, the board restructuring, the shareholder communication." "Celeste." His arm didn't move. 10 minutes. You've got 10 minutes. She closed her eyes. She had spent 30 years walking into rooms and proving that she belonged. Proving it with numbers and strategy and endurance and the sheer accumulative force of being right more often than anyone expected. She had proven it again this morning in the most public, consequential way she ever had. And what she felt right now in this corridor was not the satisfaction of being right. It was simpler than that. Harder to name and easier to feel. The particular relief of being held by someone who wasn't keeping score. "After all of this settles," she said, "I want to take Mia somewhere. The planetarium or somewhere, just the 3 of us." She felt his arm tighten slightly. 1 degree. Barely perceptible. "Yeah," he said. "She'd like that." Down the corridor, Marcus appeared at the door of a conference room and raised his eyebrows in the direction of his watch. She saw it over Brennan's shoulder. She straightened, smoothed her jacket. She was, again, completely composed. But it was a different composure now, not armor, just herself. "Thank you," she said to Brennan, "for being here." "Always," he said. She walked toward the conference room. At the door, she glanced back once. He was still standing against the wall where she'd left him, arms folded again, coffee cup in hand, watching her go with the same expression she'd seen outside Alara on a rainy night 3 months ago. The comfortable, uncomplicated look of someone who is not pretending to feel something they don't. She turned and went to work. Behind her, in the room she'd just left, the last remaining traces of Gavin Mercer's careful architecture lay in a document folder on a mahogany table, awaiting whatever came next from people whose job it was to deal with such things. And in the main hall, 947 people's jobs were safe for another quarter. Because someone had refused to leave before the fight was over. The weeks after the summit moved the way recovery always does. Not cleanly, not all at once, but in overlapping layers that settled at different speeds. The SEC investigation formally opened within 48 hours of the filing. Gavin Mercer retained counsel and issued a statement through his attorneys that said nothing meaningful in carefully constructed sentences, which was consistent with how he'd operated for 3 years. The board appointed an independent chair on an interim basis while the restructuring process was formalized. Calloway, who had been the first board member to react visibly to Ray's presentation, reached out to Celeste directly the following Monday to say that he intended to support a governance review that would prevent the kind of vulnerability Gavin had exploited. She thanked him. She meant it. The stock recovered in 10 days. Not because the market had suddenly developed a conscience about how it had treated the story. Markets don't work that way, and she'd long since stopped expecting them to, but because the underlying company was sound, had always been sound, and once the noise cleared, the numbers were what they'd always been. Diane sent her a one-line email when the price crossed back above its pre-scandal level. Told you. Celeste saved it. Patrice managed the press with the specific competence of someone who'd been waiting months for the story to turn. The narrative shifted. Not immediately, not completely, but measurably. Financial media ran follow-ups on the forensic evidence. A long-form piece in a business publication traced the arc of Gavin's methodology, and the piece was fair in ways that surprised her because fairness in that context had stopped feeling automatic. Several of the outlets that had run the unkind headlines ran corrections or follow-ups that were less unkind, not apologies. She hadn't expected apologies and wouldn't have trusted them anyway. Just a slight recalibration of the story being told. The comments about her appearance didn't disappear. She hadn't expected them to. The internet doesn't retract things the way a newspaper does. But something had shifted in the center of gravity of the conversation. And she noticed it the way you notice when a persistent background noise stops. Not with relief exactly, but with the quiet surprise of absence. She noticed something else too. Something smaller and more personal. People at the office looked at her differently. Not with more deference, she'd always had that, or a professional version of it. With something closer to recognition, like they'd watched her walk into a room where the odds were against her and stay anyway. And the staying meant something to them that the winning alone wouldn't have. A junior analyst named Priya, who'd been at the company for 8 months, and whom Celeste knew from a single meeting about the Singapore contract, stopped her in the elevator one morning and said, "I just wanted to say, thank you for not leaving." Then she looked like she regretted saying it and added quickly, "Sorry, I know that's—" "Don't apologize," Celeste said. "Thank you for saying it." The elevator doors opened. Priya went one way, Celeste went another, and she stood outside her office for a moment before going in. 947 people. She thought about that number differently now. Boomboots. Gavin Mercer's case moved through the regulatory process with the patience of federal timelines, which is to say, slowly and with a great deal of paperwork. He was formally removed from the board in December. Civil proceedings from the SEC followed in January. His attorney made noises about cooperation, which suggested the evidence was as airtight as Ray had assessed. She followed the proceedings the way you follow weather, aware of it, tracking its general direction, not letting it occupy the front of her mind. She had a company to run. She ran it. The governance review that Calloway had proposed became a formal initiative. She co-chaired it alongside an independent director named Adayeze Nwokolo, who had a background in corporate accountability and who asked inconvenient questions with such pleasant consistency that Celeste found herself genuinely liking her within the first meeting. The review produced a revised board charter and a set of information handling protocols that would make the kind of manipulation Gavin had run structurally much harder. It also produced, in the process of examining what had gone wrong, a recognition that Celeste had partially allowed it to go wrong by not moving faster when she'd first identified the threat. She sat with that. She didn't perform self-flagellation about it to her team because that would have been indulgent, but she sat with it privately and let it become the thing it needed to become. Not guilt, but knowledge. The kind you carry forward. Marcus put it plainly one afternoon in a way that was so Marcus she almost smiled. You caught it, you fixed it, you learned from it. That's the whole job. Nobody gets the preempt every time. I should have moved faster. Sure, file it. He shrugged. And then run the company. She filed it. She ran the company. The small business software tier got its meeting in January, 5 weeks after the summit. It took 2 meetings, actually. The first one to establish the scope of the problem, the second one to agree on the fix. The product team had known for months that the small business tier was underperforming its potential. They just hadn't had the specific language for the problem that Brennan had offered without realizing he was offering it. Does it actually work? Not does it exist. Not does it function technically. Does it work for the person sitting in a small office trying to manage inventory across 3 systems that don't talk to each other? She brought that question into the room. By February, they had a revised roadmap. She didn't tell Brennan about it immediately. When she did, in March, she said, "You're getting credited in the product brief." He looked at her. "I'm what?" "In the internal brief." The problem statement cites a conversation with an end user whose experience of the existing tier identified the core functionality gap. She kept a straight face. "That's you." "I'm not an end user. I barely use computers." "You use inventory management software that doesn't work correctly." All you said was the right thing." She looked at him. "You're in the brief, Brennan. Accept it." He made a face that she'd come to recognize as the specific expression of a man who is pleased and is uncomfortable with how pleased he is. "Colby's going to think this is hilarious. Colby will probably ask for a free subscription. He absolutely will." He shook his head. "Put his name in the brief instead." "No." He laughed. "The good one. The one that happened before he could manage it." She'd collected those laughs without meaning to, the way you collect small objects that mean something when you look at them later. They had settled into something by then, not perfectly. Nothing about it was perfect, and she'd stopped expecting it to be. What they had was real, which was better. He still drove a 12-year-old truck that he fixed himself. His apartment in Pilsen was small and warm and always slightly disordered in the way of places where a child and a single parent have been living around each other's chaos for years. She'd been there enough times now that she knew which cabinet the coffee was in and which burner on his stove ran hotter than it should, and that the throw blanket on the couch was there because Mia had claimed it and anyone else using it was technically a visitor. He'd been to her apartment enough times that he'd stopped being careful about her furniture and started being comfortable in her space, which she'd noticed and said nothing about because she didn't want to make a thing of it. The first evening he'd put his feet up on her coffee table, she'd looked at him for a moment, and then looked at the television, and that was the whole conversation. Mia had, over the months since the museum, developed what could only be described as a running research partnership with Celeste that nobody had formally agreed to, but everyone had accepted. It happened mostly over the phone. Mia would encounter something in school, or in a book, or in whatever YouTube rabbit hole she'd been down that week, and she'd have questions that went beyond what Brennan could answer, and she'd text Celeste with the specific efficiency of someone who has identified the most useful resource and sees no reason not to use it. Celeste answered every text. She did not always have the answer. Black hole thermodynamics she could manage. But Mia's current interest in quantum entanglement was pushing the limits of what Celeste knew, and she'd had to do her own reading. She didn't hide this. She'd text back, "I don't know enough about this one yet. Give me 2 days." And then she'd read about quantum entanglement and call Mia, and they'd figure it out together. Brennan watched this happen with an expression that he tried to keep neutral and didn't always succeed at. "She texts you more than she texts me," he said one evening. "You're available in person. I'm a resource." "She doesn't text Colby. Colby doesn't know about quantum entanglement. Neither did you 2 weeks ago." "Now I do." She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. "Your point?" He had no point. She could tell. He was doing the thing he did when something pleased him, and he was trying to decide whether to say it. She waited. "She likes you," he said finally. "A lot. I don't say it enough. It matters." She set down her cup. She was quiet for a moment. She knew what it cost him to say that. Not because he was reluctant about Mia. His love for his daughter was the most uncomplicated thing about him, but because it was a declaration about the future in a way that not everything they'd said to each other yet had been. It placed something, staked something into the ground. "I like her too," Celeste said. "A lot." She paused. "For the record." He nodded once, picked up his own coffee, and neither of them said anything else, because they didn't need to. That was the thing about the two of them. They'd learned to let the quiet hold what it was holding without needing to put words around all of it. It was one of the few things that had come easily. Spring arrived the way Chicago springs do, apologetically, in fits and starts, with 2 warm weeks followed by a cold snap that felt personal. By April, the city had committed. The lake went from gray to something approaching blue. The parks came back. People walked differently on the street, with the particular loosening of bodies that have been tense against the cold for 5 months. On a Saturday in late April, the 3 of them went to Lincoln Park. Not the planetarium, just the park. Mia had wanted to see if the geese were back, which they were, and she had specific opinions about the geese that she communicated at length while they walked along the water. Brennan bought popcorn from a cart, and Mia ate most of it, and the geese were disappointed. It was an unremarkable afternoon. That was the whole point of it. Celeste walked beside Brennan on a path that ran along the south edge of the park, the trees doing their early April thing with the pale green of new leaves. Mia about 30 feet ahead of them examining a goose with the scientific detachment of a researcher who has encountered an interesting specimen. The sun was at that afternoon angle that makes everything look slightly warmer than it is. She thought about the restaurant, the rainy night, the 12 strangers who'd placed bets on how fast the date would fail. She thought about all the rooms she'd walked into alone. The board calls and the board battles and the late nights and the mornings she'd come in knowing the day was going to be hard and done it anyway because there was no version of her life in which she didn't. She thought about being 12 years old watching her father lose something, about deciding, from that, to build a world where people didn't have to lose fixable things. She thought about what it had cost her to stay in the fight and what it would have cost her to leave it. The different shapes of those 2 costs. How easy it is to dress surrender as wisdom when you're afraid enough. She thought about Brennan saying you spent your whole life proving your worth to everyone else in her kitchen at midnight, with the rain coming down and the city indifferent outside her window. She thought about how long she'd been waiting for someone to see past the thing the world decided to see first, and how she'd stopped believing that was a thing that would happen. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet attrition of repeated disappointment, until you stop noticing you've given up on something. Brennan had not fixed that. She wanted to be precise about that, because she'd spent enough of her life watching people attribute women's growth to the men who'd loved them, and she had no patience for that narrative. She had fixed it herself, mostly. She'd walked into the fight and stayed in the fight, and won the fight. That was hers. But he'd been in the room while she got there, and that had mattered, the specific, unremarkable fact of another person who chose to stay. She looked at him walking beside her, the comfortable way he moved, the wrinkled quality of his jacket that was different from the summit suit. This was weekend Brennan, which was the real one. She looked at his hands, one of which was holding the remnant of the popcorn bag, and she thought about the night in the corridor outside the boardroom when he'd put his arm around her and said nothing, just stayed. She thought, I want this. Not the idea of it, this specific, imperfect, ongoing thing. I want to keep choosing it. Ahead of them, Mia had apparently said something to the goose that the goose had found objectionable because there was a commotion, and then Mia retreating with great speed toward them, laughing. It came at me, she said, slightly breathless, still laughing, her planet jacket unzipped and her hair coming out of its braid on one side. You approached it, Brennan said. I was being scientific. You were being a goose aggressor. I was gathering data. She looked at Celeste. It honked at me. That's communication. I was communicating back. What did you say to it? Celeste asked. Mia considered this with more seriousness than the question probably warranted. I was explaining that geese have been evolutionarily unchanged for a very long time, and they should probably be more interested in adaptation. Brennan made a sound. Celeste looked at him and found him pressing his lips together with the specific effort of a father who is committed to not laughing at his child's expense and is finding it difficult. The goose disagreed, Celeste said. The goose was being defensive, Mia said. Sometimes the things we say that are true are still unwelcome, Celeste said. Mia thought about that with the seriousness she gave everything. Then, like when Dad tells me the orbital period of Pluto isn't actually that impressive compared to Neptune's moons. That is a different situation, Brennan said. You said it at my presentation. in front of 3 people. 3 is still, Mia. He pointed down the path. More geese. Go be scientific. She went, with a look that promised this conversation was not over. They watched her go. In the quiet after, Brennan reached over and took Celeste's hand, not with any particular ceremony, the way you do when you've been walking next to someone long enough that it starts to feel like the natural continuation of the walk. She let him. They walked like that for a while. The park moved around them, a dog running, 2 kids on bikes, a pair of elderly women on a bench sharing a bag of chips, the ordinary, persistent texture of a Saturday afternoon in a city that was always doing several things at once and couldn't be bothered to stop for anyone's significant moment. "Hey," he said. "Hey, I've been thinking about something." She glanced at him, his profile, the way the afternoon light caught the lines at the corners of his eyes that she'd stopped noticing individually because she'd started seeing his whole face as a thing that was simply familiar to her. "Okay," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped because he did. They were under a section of path where the trees had come far enough in to form something close to a canopy, not the arched golden leaf architecture of autumn, but the spare new green of April, light coming through in pieces. An unremarkable spot, a spot where nothing significant had ever happened. He let go of her hand and turned to face her. He put his hand in his jacket pocket and she watched his face and understood, 1 second before it happened, what was about to happen. He pulled out a ring. It was not extravagant. She noticed that first, and what she felt about it was the thing that told her everything she needed to know about how well he understood her. It was a simple band with a single stone, not small, but not performing its own importance. The kind of ring that said, "I thought about you specifically," not about what a ring is supposed to say. He held it and looked at her. "I don't have a speech," he said. "I thought about writing one, and everything I wrote sounded like I was trying too hard." He looked down at the ring briefly, then back at her. "You're the most difficult person I've ever tried to get close to. And I don't mean that as a complaint. I mean, you built walls that made sense given everything that came before me. And I knew that, and I kept showing up anyway because every time I got past one wall, there was a person on the other side worth getting to." She was very still. "I'm not asking you because the company's okay now. I'm not asking you because the hard part is over, because I don't think the hard part is over. There's going to be more Gavins, more press, more rooms where people decide what you are before you open your mouth." He held her gaze. "I want to be in those rooms with you, not in front of you, not behind you, right there next to you, the same way I have been." She heard the echo of her own kitchen, her own words from months ago return to her in a different context. The specific, unremarkable fact of another person who chooses to stay. "Mia already knows I was going to ask you," he said. She said, and I'm quoting, "obviously," which is either encouraging or humbling. I haven't decided. Something moved across his face. "I want us to be a family, the 3 of us, whatever that looks like, however it works. I'm not asking you to change what you're building. I'm asking to build something with you." 30 feet ahead, Mia had stopped pretending to look at geese. She was standing on the path facing them with her arms at her sides and her chin slightly up, watching with the serious brown eyes that missed nothing, her planet jacket caught in the April wind. Celeste looked at Brennan. She thought about the first night, the restaurant, the rain, the whispers, the bets. She thought about sitting in her car 3 blocks from Alara with one hand over her mouth, holding something she didn't have a word for. She thought about all the years she'd spent in rooms full of people who saw a body when they looked at her. A liability. A story. A punchline dressed up as a headline. She thought about this man who had walked across a dining room in a wrinkled jacket and said, "I'm glad you didn't leave," and had meant it about every room since. She thought about what it means to be seen, not performed for, not managed, not tolerated, actually seen, the specific, complicated, non-ideal person you actually are, seen and wanted anyway, in full knowledge of the cost. She had built a company from nothing. She had fought for it and held it and refused to let it be taken. She had walked through every room alone that she'd had to walk through alone, and she had done it with her head up, and she did not regret one step of it. And she was tired of walking alone. Not in the broken way, in the ready way. The way you're tired at the end of something hard that is finally done. Yes, she said. It came out clean. No qualifications around it, just the word, which was the whole answer. Something in Brennan's face went soft in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the smile, not the composed steadiness, but something underneath all of it that was usually kept private. He slid the ring onto her finger. His hands were steady. Hers weren't, quite. It fit. Of course it fit. He had asked Dana, who had asked with the particular relentlessness that Dana brought to everything she considered important. Obviously, Celeste said. What? Mia's word. Obviously. She looked down at her hand briefly, then back at him. She was right. He laughed. The real one. And she put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him in an unremarkable spot under April trees in a park full of ordinary Saturday people, and nobody photographed it, and nobody placed any bets, and the city kept doing all its things around them without pausing for a moment. When they broke apart, Mia was there. She had covered the 30 feet with the efficiency of a person who had been waiting as long as she intended to. She looked at Celeste's hand, then at her father, then at Celeste. I knew it, she said. You said obviously, Brennan said. Obviously and I knew it are the same thing. She turned to Celeste with the directness that had, from the first morning at the museum, been one of the things Celeste admired most about her. Does this mean you're going to live with us? We're going to figure out the details, Celeste said. Dad's apartment is smaller than yours. I'm aware. You could get a bigger one, together. She said it with the practical simplicity of someone for whom the logistics of love are secondary to its function. That would make sense. Mia, Brennan said, I'm just saying, I know what you're saying. It's a valid point. Celeste looked at Brennan over the top of Mia's head. He made a face. She pressed her lips together. The three of them stood on a path in Lincoln Park on a Saturday in April. A mechanic and a billionaire and a small person in a planet jacket who was already reorganizing the future to her satisfaction. It is a valid point, Celeste said. Mia looked vindicated. Brennan looked at the sky briefly with the expression of a man outnumbered. Fine, he said. Valid point. So we'll figure it out? Mia asked. We'll figure it out, Celeste said. Mia nodded, satisfied, and turned back toward the path. Okay. I want to see if the geese went to the other side. She walked ahead, braid bouncing, jacket catching the wind, already on to the next thing. Brennan and Celeste stood for a moment in the space she'd left. She's going to organize our entire lives, he said. She already is. Celeste started walking. Keep up. There are things about this story that resist the clean version. Celeste and Brennan did not ride off into a perfect future. The SEC proceedings against Gavin Mercer extended into the following year and required her deposition twice, which was not romantic and cost her 2 full days and significant energy each time. The board restructuring had friction. New governance never arrives without it. There were quarters at Whitmore Dynamics that were harder than anticipated, a contract that fell through in Germany, a product launch that had to be delayed 6 weeks because the testing wasn't ready. She made decisions she second-guessed. She made at least one she got wrong and had to correct publicly, which cost her something, as public corrections always do. Brennan's shop had a bad stretch in the fall. Supply chain issues that rippled through the auto industry and hit small independents disproportionately. There was a month where Vail and Colby's margins were tight enough that he didn't sleep well for 3 weeks and was short-tempered in a way that he recognized and didn't always manage correctly. He and Celeste had an argument in October about money, specifically about her offer to help with the shop's cash position, and his refusal, and the thing underneath both of those that was about autonomy and pride, and the complicated terrain of 2 people from very different financial circumstances trying to build something equal. It was a real argument. It didn't resolve in one conversation. It took 3 conversations and some silence and some time before they found the language for it. They found it. That's the part worth noting. Not that they didn't have the argument, but that they stayed in the room until they worked through it. Mia turned 9 in November and announced at her birthday dinner, which was at a restaurant of her choosing, which was not Alara, but a pizza place in Lincoln Park, because Mia had very specific opinions about deep dish, that she had decided her career trajectory was going to be both astronaut and astrophysicist, because there was no reason to choose. Celeste told her that was correct. Brennan told her she'd need to focus harder on math. Mia said she was already focusing on math. He said focus harder anyway. She said fine. They ate pizza. The evening was not cinematic. It was better than cinematic. They moved into an apartment together in January, a compromise between his neighborhood and hers, which landed them in Bucktown, which neither of them had specifically wanted, and both of them found within 6 weeks that they actually liked. The apartment was bigger than his and smaller than hers, and had a room for Mia with a window that faced east, which she identified as ideal for morning sky observation and began immediately treating as a personal observatory. The wedding was in May. Small. Not because Celeste couldn't have made it large. She could have, and several people expressed opinions about the fact that she didn't. But because she'd spent enough of her life in rooms full of people watching her, that the idea of choosing to make her most private moment a public spectacle held exactly zero appeal. They invited family, close friends, the people who had actually been in the rooms. Dana was there, which was appropriate, because without Dana there would have been no blind date on a rainy Tuesday, no restaurant, no 12 strangers placing bets, no beginning. Colby was there. He cried, which he would deny for years afterward. Marcus was there, and Diane, and Ray, and Patrice, and Ferris, who had called Celeste after the board vote to apologize in the way Celeste had known she would, which was to say thoroughly and without self-pity, and whom Celeste had told to stop apologizing and stay on the board because they needed people willing to ask hard questions. Adayeze Nwokolo was there, because by then Celeste had decided she was keeping her. Mia was the flower girl, a role she had agreed to with the condition that she be allowed to give a short speech, which she did with the composure and directness of someone who had never once in her life been afraid of a room. The speech was 3 minutes long and included a brief summary of the anthropological significance of public commitment rituals across cultures, which she'd researched, and then it ended with, "My dad is not good at saying how he feels out loud, but when Celeste was having a really hard time, he drove through a storm to bring her soup. I think that's what love actually is. Not the saying, the driving." There was not a dry eye. Brennan, standing at the front of the room in the suit he'd bought for the summit and had now used twice for significant occasions, looked at his daughter with an expression that had no category. The particular look of a parent who has watched their child become something exceeding what they'd hoped. Celeste, standing beside him, watched Mia step away from the microphone and felt the thing she'd stopped being able to call by the wrong words. Not effective, not solved, happy. The clean, specific kind that Brennan had asked her about on their first night, the kind she'd said she didn't have an answer for. She had an answer now. There is something worth saying about what this story is actually about. Not the board drama, not the fraud, not the headlines, or the stock prices, or the forensic accounting. Those are the architecture of it, the bones. What the story is actually about is simpler and harder to say. It is about what happens when someone decides you are worth the effort before you've proven it to them. Before the board vote, before the win, before you've earned it in the specific currency they could have been demanding. When someone sees the whole picture, the difficulty and the walls and the weight of what you're carrying, and chooses anyway. Not because they need something from you, because they see you. Most of us spend a great deal of our lives performing, not dishonestly. We perform to survive, to belong, to avoid the particular pain of being seen and then rejected. We learn, usually early and usually through something that hurt, that the safest version of ourselves is the curated one. The one that leads with competence or humor or generosity or whatever armor we've figured out works best. We show people the parts of us that are easiest to like, and we protect the rest. And we call that wisdom. Sometimes it is wisdom. But sometimes it becomes a prison you've built so carefully that you've forgotten you have the key. Celeste had forgotten. For a long time. She'd been so focused on being the thing she needed to be, capable, unassailable, worth the space she was taking up in rooms that had been built for people who didn't look like her, that she'd stopped leaving room for herself to be human inside it, to be uncertain, to be tired, to say, I don't know, or I'm scared, or I need someone in the room while I figure this out. Brennan Vale, who drives a 12-year-old truck and is bad at bookkeeping and shows up with soup from a diner because it's the thing he can do, He did not fix any of that. Let's be clear, people don't fix each other. That's not how it works, and any story that tells you otherwise is selling something. What he did was simpler. He stayed. He asked real questions and listened to real answers and didn't run when the answers were complicated. He was present without making his presence a performance. And in staying, he gave her something specific: the experience of being known. Not the curated version, the actual one. That is rarer than it sounds. That is, for many people, the thing they spend a lifetime looking for without always knowing what to name it. And Celeste, who built a company from nothing, who walked into a boardroom where the votes were stacked against her and refused to leave before the fight was over, who cried in her own kitchen at midnight and got up the next morning and called her lawyer at 6 a.m. She gave him something back. She gave him the experience of being chosen by someone who did not need him, who was not with him because she had nowhere else to be, or because she was afraid to be alone, or because he filled a gap. She chose him from a position of complete self-sufficiency, which is the only kind of choosing that means anything. Mia was right in her 3-minute wedding speech. Love is the driving. It's not the declaration or the grand gesture, though those have their place. It's the showing up on a Tuesday when you didn't have to, the staying on the line when there's nothing left to say, the driving through the storm because the other person turned off their phone and you needed to do something and soup was the thing you could do. Love is the accumulation of small choices. The decision, made again and again in unremarkable moments, to stay in the room. On a Sunday morning in the summer after the wedding, Celeste woke early. The apartment in Bucktown had good eastern light. Mia had claimed this as a feature, not an accident when they'd chosen it, and the bedroom filled with it slowly while Brennan was still asleep beside her. She lay there for a while in the particular quiet of early morning in a city that hasn't started yet, and she looked at the ceiling and thought about nothing specific. She could hear Mia in the kitchen, the careful sounds of someone who is trying to make toast without making noise, which Mia was not good at but sincerely attempted. There was a soft clatter, and then a pause, and then the sounds resumed. In a while there would be breakfast. Mia would appear with something she'd assembled with slightly more confidence than expertise, and they would eat it and it would be fine, maybe even good, and they would argue mildly about what to do with the day. And Brennan would want to take a walk, and Mia would want to go somewhere specific, and Celeste would end up mediating in the direction of whoever had made the better argument, which was usually Mia, who had her father's stubbornness and her own particular gift for logic. It would be ordinary, imperfect, real. She turned her head and looked at Brennan, still asleep, one arm thrown across his face in the way he slept when the room was too bright. He needed a haircut. He'd been saying he needed a haircut for 3 weeks and hadn't gotten around to it. She thought about the restaurant, the rainy night, the bets. She thought about the 12 strangers who had decided before the evening started what it meant, who had read the setup, billionaire CEO, ordinary mechanic, a world that had opinions about both of them, and written the ending before anyone had a chance to live it. She thought about how easy it is to be the person who decides what a story means from the outside, how comfortable it is, in a dining room or a boardroom or a comment section, to render judgment on a life you're not living, how little it costs the people who do that, how much it costs the people they do it to. And then she thought about how none of it, ultimately, had mattered. Not because the judgment hadn't hurt, it had, and some of it still did, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidy ending, but because she had lived her life anyway. She had walked into the rooms and she had fought the fights, and she had let herself be loved by someone who showed up with soup, and none of the people who placed bets on her humiliation had any say in how it turned out. The world will have opinions about you, about your body, your choices, your relationships, your worth. It will form those opinions quickly and hold them loosely and revise them based on whichever story is most convenient to tell. That will not change. That is not a problem you can solve or a battle you can win definitively. You can only decide, every day, in every room, whether you are going to live inside those opinions or outside them. She had chosen outside, not perfectly, not without cost, not without the nights when she'd turned off her phone and sat in the dark and been very close to something that looked like surrender, but she had chosen outside. Brennan stirred. He moved his arm and looked at her with the particular blankness of someone emerging from deep sleep. What time is it? He said. Early. Why are you awake? I was thinking. About what? She looked at him. The ceiling light. The apartment in Bucktown with its good eastern windows. The sounds of Mia in the kitchen, managing toast with more earnestness than success. About how it turned out, she said. He was quiet for a moment, still not fully awake. Then, and? She reached over and took his hand. His hand, which was rough in the places that hands go rough from real work, which she'd noticed the first night when he'd pulled out her chair and which she would notice for the rest of her life. And I'm glad I didn't leave, she said. He looked at her. The good look. The real one. The one that had no performance in it. Yeah, he said. Outside, the city was coming back to life. The lake was doing whatever the lake was doing, which it had been doing for 10,000 years and would go on doing regardless of any of this. Somewhere in the kitchen, toast emerged. There was the sound of a small person saying something to herself in the satisfied tone of someone whose project has succeeded. Brennan got up. Celeste followed. They went to have breakfast. And the morning was ordinary and imperfect and entirely theirs.